arrangement that guaranteed 50 years of relative autonomy to Hong Kong, freedom of expression, independent judiciary, strong democratic systems. And over the past 2 decades, Hong Kong's unique status has allowed it to flourish, to prosper. Human capital, privileged financial position as a gateway to China with a trusted common law system of law and courts have turned Hong Kong into a hub of finance and trade. Historically, in Hong Kong, corruption is low, contracts are honored, judges can rule fairly and independently, journalists and academics enjoy freedom of expression, and human rights are generally respected. Hong Kong has seen its success create a vibrant society. This is a glaring embarrassment to the Chinese mainland. One country, two systems is an embarrassment if the smaller system is working much better. Now, this does not mean that Hong Kong was perfectly free or that the system it had in place last year was perfectly democratic. But compared to the government in Beijing, it shows the people of China what can be done by moving in the direction of freedom. In December, as chair of the Asia Subcommittee, I hosted a hearing titled Authoritarianism with Chinese Characteristics, Political and Religious Human Rights Challenges in China, and that hearing featured the Vice President of the City University of Hong Kong Students' Union, Joey Siu. The committee passed a resolution at my suggestion by unanimous consent last year, supporting the right of Hong Kongers to protest. No one should face life in prison for going to the street to voice their opposition, not in this country, not in Hong Kong, not anywhere. The one country, two systems was designed to safeguard Hong Kong's role in as a thriving financial center. Now Hong Kongers are fleeing Hong Kong out of fear for their safety, and we should support their right to do so. Though the right we really want to support is the right of all Hong Kongers to the level of autonomy promised in the one country, two systems agreement. We have witnesses in the last 24 hours, nothing short of terrifying events in Hong Kong. We need to reject this Chinese violation of China's own international commitments and the commitments they have made to their own people. The peoples of Hong Kong expected China to honor the commitment under the two systems part of the agreement, but over the past few years, Beijing has chipped away at Hong Kong's freedoms. In 2014, when officials in Beijing curtailed voting rights for the people of Hong Kong, a new generation of democracy activists under the banner of the Umbrella Movement came to the forefront. Year after year, injustice after injustice, a broadening coalition of Hong Kongers from all walks of life have taken to the streets to protest their rights. Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping has launched an unprecedented attack against Hong Kong. Beijing's national security law undermines the very essence of Hong Kong's autonomy by introducing a new range of offenses and punishments for so-called crimes against the state. The legislation will compromise Hong Kong's independent judiciary and severely curtail freedom of expression and criminalize dissent. So why is China willing to break these commitments? Unfortunately, when we look down Pennsylvania Avenue, we see an administration willing to, in effect, tell China that its obligations to human rights, whether it be in Hong Kong or whether it be the Uyghur people, will simply not catch the attention of the American administration. We have squandered months without speaking out at the executive level. Hong Kong's been on the back burner in an effort to sell soybeans, and we haven't even sold the soybeans. President Trump spent January and February of this year praising Xi personally for how he handled the coronavirus. Now, he has taken the exact opposite approach. We need consistency in the White House, and we need a consistent adherence to our own standards of human rights. I'm grateful to our witnesses for the insight and experience they bring us, and I will now move toward introducing the witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Cheuk Yan, a former member of the Hong Kong Legislative Council. He is the General Secretary of the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions and Vice Chairman of the Hong Kong Labor Party. Why don't we hear from...
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Smith would like to make a few opening remarks, if that would be acceptable.
Were your opening remarks less than 5 minutes, Mr. McCall?
I wasn't keeping time, but it was three minutes.
I think that would open it up to everyone here. Is there...
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Smith be recognized for 3 minutes.
Seeing unanimous consent, I want to hear from a champion of human rights, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. McCall. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my good friend from Virginia. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for your very eloquent statement, and we have worked together for well over 3 decades on combating human rights abuse by China. During the Tiananmen Square, during the MFN battles, and all the others, we were joined in a very, very bipartisan way. Frank Wolf, you might recall, Tom Lantos, all of us speaking very aggressively against aiding and abetting this horrific dictatorship, which has only gotten worse under Xi Jinping. So thank you for your leadership. Mr. Chairman, the great freedom-loving people of Hong Kong have just had another draconian anti-democratic law imposed upon them. And that is called the so-called national security law. It severely penalizes democracy activists, and even terms like collusion are outlined in the new law, and it defines that any contact with external actors like human rights organizations, journalists, members of Congress, those great people like Joshua Wong and others who have come here and said, all this we're asking Xi Jinping is for freedom. That's it. And to live up to your own promises made in the basic law and in the joint communique between Hong Kong and China, which facilitated the transfer, the conveyance of Hong Kong to China. They have broken their word. You know, words matter, and it is a matter of international law that they committed for at least 50 years to having these 2 Chinas, 2 systems, 1 China. And now they're breaking it with impunity. Let's not forget that Xi Jinping continues to commit pervasive human rights abuse against the Chinese people, including the use of torture, which has been documented over and again by the special rapporteurs for the United Nations, forced abortion, forced sterilization. Mr. McCall rightly pointed out that they're using those tools of repression as a means of genocide to eliminate the Muslims in the Xinjiang region, 10 million strong. They're going after them to destroy their children, to destroy their families, and of course, 1 to 2 million are in concentration camps. The crushing of the Tibetan people continues unabated, and of course, there's no labor rights. And under Xi Jinping, under what he calls synchronization, there's an all-out effort to end all religious practice unless it comports with Marxist principles. It's called synodization, and it is going from bad to worse. The Hong Kong Human Rights Act, and I was the House sponsor of it, it was a bipartisan bill. Obviously, Mr. Swazi was our principal co-sponsor, 130 co-sponsors or so, backed by everybody on this committee. That is now law, and the President did sign it, and pursuant to that law, on schedule, he did make the statement that the loss of autonomy has happened. So we need to unite now. Democrats, Republicans, we've done it before. We've got to do it with the President, and the world needs to unite against this pervasive human rights abuser, Xi Jinping, and this draconian law that they just put into effect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you for those comments and for decades of dedication to human rights. I'm going to introduce all the witnesses and then call on them in turn. Our second witness is going to be Professor Carole J. Petersen, Professor of Law at the William S. Richardson School of Law and Graduate Chair in the Sparks M. Matsunaga Institute of Peace at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Next, we will have Mr. Nathan Law, the founding chairman of the pro-democracy organization, Demosito, and the youngest ever elected lawmaker when he won a seat on the Hong Kong Legislative Council in 2016. Last, we will have Brian Leung Kai-ping, a Hong Kong democracy activist known for reading a statement on behalf of the protesters at the Legislative Council that crystallized the 5 demands for the 2019 anti-extradition movement. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. I will recognize each witness for 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statement will be made part of the record. I will first call upon Mr. Yan for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the invitation to talk about the situation of Hong Kong at this very, very critical moment. The passing of the National Security Law by the National People's Congress yesterday has sounded the death knell for one country, two systems. The people of Hong Kong was not shown any wordings of the law when it was passed, showing the contempt of the Chinese Communist Party on the rights of the people of Hong Kong. This represents the second handover for Hong Kong, and for me personally, my third handover. On July 1st, 1997, Hong Kong was handed over to China by the British government under the promise of one country, two systems, guaranteed by the Basic Law. The imposition of national security law on Hong Kong represents the second handover with the promise of high autonomy for 50 years, all broken. And Hong Kong was handed over back to China as one country, one system. For me, personally, it is my third handover. Why is that? I was arrested on June 5th, 1989, just after the Tiananmen Square massacre, for bringing support to the democracy movement in Tiananmen Square, the support of the people of Hong Kong. Thanks to a strong outcry in Hong Kong, I was released after 3 days. And since that day, I devote my lifetime to work toward democratic changes in China as one of the leaders in the Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic democratic movement in China. After the passing of national security law, will people like me be tried in Hong Kong or hand over to China for trial because of our condemnation of Tiananmen Square massacre in our candlelight vigil every year, or the setting up of June 4th Museum, and our continued support for human rights in China? Would there be a fourth handover awaiting me? The new law just promulgated 11 p.m. 30th of June 2020 is a complete destruction of the rule of law in Hong Kong and threatens every aspect of freedom the people of Hong Kong enjoy under the international human rights standard or the Basic Law. When I read through the detailed description of 4 elements of national security crime: subversion, secession, terrorism, and collusion with foreign power, the net is spread very, very wide. And I believe that in the drafting of law, what go into the mind of the Communist Party is all the action taken over the past protest movement. So when they are so angry with the protest movement, so they count every act and try to criminalize every act in the past and try to cover it this time under the national security law, so that it can be a revenge against the people of Hong Kong for what we have done in the past years. To give you an example, waving of foreign flag or flag for independence may come under secession, the crime of secession. Actually, today, on July 1st, there are already people, just because they wave something like a flag, and they are arrested. And even the police had sort of, make a banner warning people that if you wave a flag or shout a slogan, you may be charged under the law of national security law of secession or subversion. And other things also included in the law is to attack or damage Hong Kong government facility, rendering it unable to function or severely interfere with the legal functioning of the state apparatus by violence or illegal means, can be caught by subversion. And of course, we don't like to see damage of government facility, but is that subversion? Or damaging public transport can fall under terrorism. And collusion with foreign power included through illegal means in promotion of hatred towards the central government. No one wants to promote hatred. We just want freedom. Or severely block the Hong Kong government or the central government from implementation of laws and policy with serious consequences. So collusion will include blocking of policy. So the law will, and also about the enforcement of the law. The law will be enforced by National Security Agency with personnel from China and Hong Kong with the special unit of the Hong Kong police and the power to search, conduct secret surveillance, interception of communication, which actually, everyone knows this is the operation of like a secret police. And applying this law in Hong Kong, many people had asked whether the Hong Kong Alliance, our organization, founding platform of end to one-party rule state, or our past support of human rights defender in China deemed to be subversion. Can people of Hong Kong shout the slogan, down with Carrie Lam or defund the police, and get caught of subverting the Hong Kong government? With the
Yan?
media reporting
Mr. Yan?
BC and aiding and abetting? Yes?
Your 5 minutes is expired. If you could give us one or
sorry.
two, just a couple of sentences, then I need to move on to the next witness.
Okay, so with the destruction of one country, two system and rule of law and in its place, rule of fear, Hong Kongers have to learn to live and survive in a very, very suppressive environment, and still we must retain the will to resist. And for us, we will continue our past activities and not deterred by the new authoritarian law. We will fight on for freedom and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Now recognize Professor Petersen for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. I'm testifying from my personal capacity and not on behalf of my university or any organization. I taught law in Hong Kong from 1989 to 2006, and I co-edited a book on the local government's first attempt to enact national security legislation. Although I now teach in Hawaii, I continue to visit Hong Kong for research, and I've spent most of my academic career writing about Hong Kong. My initial written testimony submitted 2 days ago was based on the limited summary of the law that had been published at that point. Now that the actual law has been published, I have no doubt that it violates China's obligations under the Sino-British Joint Declaration. The Joint Declaration makes it clear that Hong Kong is to operate a separate criminal justice system. It shall maintain its common law legal system, control criminal prosecutions free from any interference, and exercise independent judicial power. Unfortunately, this law destroys that firewall. It allows mainland Chinese security personnel to operate openly in Hong Kong, and in some cases to remove individuals entirely from the protections of Hong Kong's legal system. As Mr. Lee said, it establishes numerous institutions in Hong Kong, which will be directly under the authority of the Chinese central authorities. The Office for Safeguarding National Security will be functioning in Hong Kong. It will collect and analyze information, it will guide, coordinate, support, and generally supervise all of the relevant authorities in the Hong Kong government. Although Article 50 states that the staff shall abide by
I didn't bring my
there is no mechanism
hotspot
against them. They are subject to national supervisory authorities only and not to the jurisdiction of the Hong Kong SAR. There will also be a special branch of the police and a special branch of the prosecution authority, and they will be primarily accountable to the central authorities. If these mechanisms did not give Beijing enough control, it can also take complete jurisdiction over a case and remove it from Hong Kong's legal system under Article 55. The conditions that allow for this to happen are very broad, and there are very limited procedures. A simple request from the chief executive, which she will surely give if directed to do so, can be approved by the central government. At that point, Hong Kong's legal system simply does not apply. The mainland Chinese criminal procedure will take over, and the person will be prosecuted and tried under mainland law, presumably in the mainland. The extensive involvement of China's central security officials in the enforcement of this law is particularly worrying when we combine it with the broadly defined offenses. Time does not allow me to explore them all with you today, but one example is collusion with a foreign country. That is defined so broadly that if a person merely testifies today and asks a foreign government to impose sanctions, that could be considered a violation of Article 29(4). Moreover, it applies regardless of whether you are a Hong Kong national or a Hong Kong resident. anyone can be prosecuted so long as they commit the offense in Hong Kong or the consequences of the act occur in Hong Kong. For individuals who are permanent residents of Hong Kong, and thousands of American citizens are in that category, the coverage of the law is even broader. If a permanent resident of Hong Kong who is now living in the US merely requests sanctions against Hong Kong or China, that person could be held criminally liable even if the requested sanctions were never ordered. Moreover, if a person wanted to prosecute that person in the mainland, it might decide to invoke Article 55. The remainder of my testimony discusses a number of vague provisions in the law and raises the question of who will be interpreting it. We do know that the NPC Standing Committee has the power, the overriding power, to interpret vague clauses, but the law is silent as to whether the courts of Hong Kong also have the power to interpret the law. This is significant because the courts of Hong Kong will probably try to interpret this law to comply with the ICCPR so long as there are no direct conflicts. Where there is a direct conflict, then this law will prevail. And that means that China will be in breach of its obligation under the Sino-British Joint Declaration to ensure that the ICCPR continues to be in force in Hong Kong. One of the examples of a clear conflict is Article 42, which says that no bail shall be granted unless the judge has sufficient grounds for believing that the criminal suspect or defendant will not continue to commit acts endangering national security. Not only does this violate Article 9 of the ICCPR, but it also violates the presumption of innocence because it assumes that the person has already committed acts threatening national security. These and other conflicts with protected human rights violate the commitments that China made under the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Incidentally, the UN Human Rights Committee will be reviewing Hong Kong's compliance with the ICCPR beginning this summer when the fourth periodic report is reviewed.
Professor?
Traditionally, yes, I'll
Professor,
finish.
it appears that, yes. Just sum up in a couple sentences, please.
Certainly. Traditionally, the review process before the UN Human Rights Committee includes extensive shadow reports filed by non-governmental organizations. However, this year, I fear that NGOs will be afraid to file those shadow reports for the fear that just asking the UN Human Rights Committee to declare that there's been a violation of the ICCPR might bring about the threat of criminal prosecution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I do need to move on. Thank you, Professor Petersen. We now recognize Mr. Nathan Law. Mr. Law? There seems to be a technical difficulty. Can we unmute Mr. Law? At this point, I'm going to go on to our fourth witness and then try to circle back to Mr. Law. We have Brian Leung, who's recognized for 5 minutes.
Congressman Sherman, Ranking Member McCall, and members of this committee, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to address the critical development in Hong Kong, and also thank you to Speaker Pelosi and Congressman Smith for the opening statements. China's NPCSC has unilaterally imposed a national security law on Hong Kong, which I submit fundamentally bridges the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. There is no longer a meaningful distinction between the system of Hong Kong and that of China. The legal firewall between two places has been utterly dismantled. The Chinese party state has engulfed our governance system. Our civil society is under full assault and is pervaded by a sense of political fear, self-censorship, and legal persecution. We have to reckon with the reality that itself has relegate one country to the dust of history. It is perhaps instructive to situate the enactment of the law in the first anniversary of the 2019 anti-extradition bill movement. On this very day last year, I read out on behalf of the protester a statement that crystallized the 5 demands of the movement inside the Legislative Council. Rather than responding to those very modest demands, the Chinese and Hong Kong government have chosen to ramp up their relentless repression, continuous isolation of Hong Kong from the world, and ultimately the self-destruction of one country, two systems. Since last year, 9,000 protesters have been arrested. 600 of them are being charged with rioting. The police continue to be unaccountable and instead see their budget increase by 25% compared to last year. These trends of gross violation of civil liberty will only worsen under the new national security law, which I'll explain. Above all, the supposedly withdrawn extradition bill has now morphed into a Chinese agency set up in Hong Kong, capable of extraditing defendants to China. And the Chinese Communist Party has muffled the public outcry for full democratization that is guaranteed in the Basic Law, and now respond with a resounding assertion of the party dominance inside Hong Kong judicial and political system. In this light, the grave dangers of the new national security law are not limited to its legal ramification. The new criminal offense will no doubt be used as legal weapons against dissidents and send them to life prison. No one in Hong Kong can be certain about their legal definition, and in fact, their definition will remain forever elusive as the National People's Congress has the sole authority to interpret the law, strike down any conflicting local legislation, and Beijing can advise our chief executive to handpick judges to adjudicate cases according to the party line. But the newly enacted law is also about institutionally asserting party's dominance in Hong Kong. The NPC forcefully insert the national security law into our legal system. Not only has the local legislature been completely circumvented, even our top local officials were utterly clueless about the details of the law. Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong as part of the original formulation of one country, two systems proved to be a mirage. More importantly, a set of parallel institutions will be set up and funnel the influence of the CCP in Hong Kong. First and foremost, the Office of National Security Commissioner will be established in Hong Kong and will directly report to the Communist Party and Xi Jinping himself. Not bound by the Basic Law, this office is vast with the power to supervise and guide the Hong Kong government with jurisdiction over cases pertaining to national security. This jurisdiction involves the power to extradite defendants to China where there is no respect for rule of law. It constitutes a fundamental intrusion to our judicial independence that is the cornerstone of one country, two systems. A numerous set of parallel organs mask the institutionalization of CCP dominance over our political and judicial system. And national security becomes the springboard for the CCP to tighten its grip, normalize its secretive operation, and extradite people to China. And what we are witnessing is the crumbling of one country, two systems. Since last year's movement, I've been asked numerous times, is the fight worth it given the tremendous sacrifice borne by Hong Kong people for such an almost irreparable system? In fact, many young protesters have to make the same distressing decision that I had to, which is either to be imprisoned for lives or to be exiled and forced to seek refuge elsewhere, might be possibly never seeing a chance of safe return. But my answer is always this: once we have tasted and breathed freedom, we can never be forced to kneel again. The false promise of partial freedom often made by the CCP will one day devolve into no freedom at all, as the case of Hong Kong well illustrates. What's happening in Hong Kong will soon spill over to the world, and that's why I believe the United States must hold China accountable for its continuous encroachment on Hong Kong autonomy and freedom. China should not be allowed to disregard its international obligation while benefiting from Hong Kong's special economic status. We must act now to act tangible pressure on China, including the use of a range of instruments provided by the new Hong Kong Autonomy Act just passed, and to provide substantive assistance to Hong Kong protesters, such as favorable immigration and refugee policy, for it may soon be too late. So thank you, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Leung. And now we'll see if we can hear from Mr. Nathan Law, whether we've got the technology working.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello, is it working? Yes, thank you very much. Sorry about the technical issue. Thank you, Chairman, and all the members of the committee inviting me to this hearing. In a little over 1 year, I have testified twice on Capitol Hill regarding the situation in Hong Kong. First, before the CCC in May 2019, and then before the Pacific and East Asian Subcommittee of the SFRC in September 2019. Both times, I did not have to worry about going back to Hong Kong afterward to continue my street activism. But this time is different. Merely speaking about the plight of Hong Kongers on an occasion like this contradicts the new national security law. Under this legislation, Beijing just passed 24 hours ago. Anyone who would dare to speak up would likely face imprisonment once Beijing targeted you. So much is now lost in the city I love, the freedom to tell the truth. In typical Chinese fashion, none of us knew what was in the bill until it was actually effective, which had left us very anxious. Now that we can finally read it, we are far from assured. In addition to closed trials in Hong Kong or even the possibility of extradition to China, offenders could be barred from bails and a jury trial with their rights trampled on during interrogation. The Beijing-appointed chief executive has absolute powers to determine whether an act constitutes a violation of national security, whether any information constitutes state secret, and whether covert surveillance like wiretapping can be deployed. Judges assigned to handle these cases must pass prior screening by the Chinese Communist Party. One absurd clause even dictates that inciting hatred towards either the Hong Kong or Chinese government is illegal, terms so vague that they can easily be abused, and the whole set of law left so much room for interpretation. Directly funded by Beijing, a new Hong Kong-based national security agency will have sweeping power requiring the cooperation of all local government departments. We used to think of secret police as something abstract. Now it is a very real fear. The kind of cross-border abduction that Beijing once had to hide, such as the Causeway Bay book publisher incident, may well become a new legalized norm. China is exerting de facto direct rule over Hong Kong in clear violation of the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration that promises one country, two systems. Even before the national security law, the price of resistance in Hong Kong has always been high. I've seen far too many young faces beaten, detained, tortured, prosecuted, and jailed just for protesting our basic human rights. Over 9,000 arrests have been made in protests over the past year alone. There have also been numerous incidents of mystery suicide deaths. Still, against these odds, brave Hong Kongers keep the movement alive for the sake of our future generation, as well as a more democratic world free from the threat of Chinese imperialism and expansionism. The British flag lowered for the last time and the Chinese flag rose for the first time on the very day 23 years ago in Hong Kong. While its people were understandably worried in 1997, there was at least a sense of optimism that given the success of our city, people could contribute positively to the rise of China, which would in turn embrace freedoms and democratize. This turns to be a little more than wishful thinking. Over time, China has not followed Hong Kong's lead, but has instead made Hong Kong more like itself, erasing our unique way of life while reaping the economic benefits we provide. Perhaps the national security law reveals the true nature of what Beijing thought of one country, two systems was all along comprehensive autocratic control. Increasingly, we have seen Chinese leaders less and less willing to honor the one country, two systems, part while more stressing on the dominance of one country. They have shown no regard for the separation of powers and democratic accountability, which are long taken for granted by Hong Kongers and enshrined in the Basic Law. Through fear, intimidation, and heavy-handed governance, Beijing turns Hong Kong into just another Chinese city while trying to keep its outer shell. In doing so, it hopes to preserve the illusion that the city is still autonomous. The international community must not be confused. Carrie Lam and her entire cabinet are puppets who have no power to make meaningful decisions. The high degree of autonomy once promised is just another blatant lie. It takes decades, if not longer, to build a city, but it takes just weeks to destroy it. This is what we have all seen lately. What now lies ahead of us is not just the personal safety of my friend Joshua, or other leading oppositional figures like Martin Lee and Jimmy Lai, but the survival of Hong Kong as an idea. Therefore, it is vital that while our friends in the international community, including policymakers in Washington, do not pretend that everything is still normal, they do not look away. Even though the following quotes could be considered as a violation of the national security law, I wish to say it out loud on behalf of my deep beloved Hong Kong people. 光復香港，時代革命，五大訴求，缺一不可。Let's keep fighting in different sectors, and I wish Hong Kong and all of the world the very best.
Thank you for your testimony. And I want to thank our witnesses not only for their testimony, but given the risk of Chinese retaliation, I want to thank them for their courage. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to the House rules, all time is yielded for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the hybrid format of this hearing, I will recognize members of the committee by seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans, although I will first recognize the speaker. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know, and we will come back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address us verbally. I will start by recognizing the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to yield back to you so we can hear questions from the members. But again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. I spend, Mr. Smith and I talk about the 30 years that we've worked together on this issue, but we always want to be current, and I spend about an hour a day on China issues to be current, none of them more valuable than the one I just spent here, hearing what is happening in Hong Kong in terms of this law. The concern that I have, which there may not be an answer to here, we'll see, is does this law, is it retroactive? Do they go back to any flying of flags or making of statements, or is it from now forward, which would be horrible enough? But that is a fear that I have. I want to thank our witnesses, Mr. Lee, Ms. Petersen, Mr. Leung, and Nathan, once again and again. He has courageously testified, and say to them that I think the highest compliment they could receive is to see this is an overflow crowd of Democrats and Republicans in this committee, honoring the spatial distance, overflowing into the audience. This is quite remarkable and a real expression of the bipartisan concern that we have for democracy, democratic reform, and the so-called, well, I don't even want to identify it by the name they use because it doesn't have to do with security. It has to do with repression. But I thank all of you for turning out for this because when we talk to the people of Hong Kong about what they want to see from us, they want to see our support. This committee, in a bipartisan way, has done that very significantly. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to spend my very valuable hour here to hear our witnesses and to compliment you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McCall. Thank you all.
Thank you for being here, Madam Speaker. That demonstrates a lot to the world. And as you point out, although this room doesn't look full, we have limits on how many members are allowed to be in the room, and virtually all the other members are participating virtually. With that, I'm going to recognize the ranking member for his questions, and then I'll go on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Speaker, for honoring us with your presence.
Thank you.
That's how important this issue is to all of us. I guess, my first question, I met with the Secretary. He did decertify the autonomous nature of Hong Kong. They are, Chinese Communist Party is in violation of the Sino-UK Treaty. And my question to both Mr. Law and to our Professor Petersen, in addition to the sanctions that I believe are forthcoming under the law that we passed in Congress, what else could be done to remedy and address the violation of this historic treaty?
Well, I think, yes, thank you for your question. I think it is important for us to understand that the implementation of national security law is not just about a piece of law, but is a governing philosophy that Beijing, for now, they are openly and blatantly discredit all the protection of human rights. So I think the international community should enact a mechanism to hold them accountable, because that is what they're going to do. They are going to erase the unique culture of Hong Kong and also all the human rights protection now we have had. And, well, there are hundreds of thousands of people flowing down to the street today in the protest of the implementation of national security law. And we have already seen there are lots of obvious human rights violations afterwards the implementation of the national security law. So I think the international community, other than these sanctions, which it is difficult, to hold it together. But I think we need a new guiding principle going against the expansionist China, which we have to hold them accountable in whatever human rights violation happened inside their border. So I think this is what the international community should do, and should do it jointly.
And I agree with you. Professor Petersen? Obviously,
yes, thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for the question. First, I do want to respond to the speaker's question. You're correct, the law is not retroactive. There were rumors that it might be, but it will not be. However, we can't rule out the possibility that actions taken before the law went into force may contribute to decisions to target people for investigations or prosecution. Regarding what can be done, I would like to suggest that we focus on the United Nations and the international community as a whole, because I do think it's important that we try to avoid things that could hurt the Hong Kong people and try to focus more on the international human rights monitoring mechanisms. And that is why I was mentioning in my testimony that the Human Rights Committee will be reviewing Hong Kong's report under the ICCPR, commencing this summer with the list of issues and going on into 2021. I do think that the international community can help participate in that. And although China likes often to react badly to international monitoring, the truth is that the Chinese government voluntarily agreed to this process when it agreed that the ICCPR would continue to apply to Hong Kong, and that Hong Kong would continue to report to the UN Human Rights Committee. So that committee, and also the UN Human Rights Council and the other expert mechanisms in the United Nations, I do think can help to shine a light on violations of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that is our next course of action. I see Chairman Engel has arrived, and with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning, everyone. I apologize for running a little behind this morning. Let me thank the Honorable Speaker for having joined us today. Her presence underscores the importance of this issue. She's always been in the forefront of this issue. We've had many, many discussions about Hong Kong. And as we look to the uncertain future of Hong Kong's autonomy and democratic system, we see that our speaker has been a tireless champion for human rights, for the rights of the people of Hong Kong and China. So thank you to our witnesses as well for your time this morning, and thank you to Mr. McCall, our ranking member, and other members of the committee. As the Chinese government escalates its aggression toward Hong Kong, I'm proud that the Congress has spoken again with a bipartisan voice, again and again, in support of the people of Hong Kong, in support of their struggle to preserve their rights, rights that have been guaranteed by treaty and international law. But at the end of the day, it's the White House that sets policy, and I fear that our policy has gone astray, perhaps emboldening China. We should be focused on two major elements in our policy toward Hong Kong. One is, does it support autonomy and democracy in Hong Kong? And secondly, does it advance American interests? We hear lots of tough talk about Vietnam from the administration, but I fear that months of this attitude of heaping praise on Xi, looking the other way as the Chinese government violently cracked down on protests in Hong Kong, sidelining any concerns about human rights in the hopes of getting a good trade deal. That has set the stage for what we're seeing today. Nothing the Beijing government does would surprise me, nor should it surprise anyone. And if there's one thing I think all Americans should be united on, it's this. I remember when the agreement was signed with the UK, there were going to be two different types of government, one China, but two different types, two systems. Of course, the Chinese Beijing government is not abiding by that at all, and did anybody ever think that they would? So let me say that one of the more unanticipated provisions in this national security law is Article 38, which states that the law applies to persons who are not permanent residents of Hong Kong and commit crimes under the law outside of Hong Kong. When combined with Beijing's increased use of hostage diplomacy, such as the case of the two impeached Canadians, this law could have far-reaching implications for anyone visiting Hong Kong, including U.S. persons who are studying, doing business, or working as government officials or diplomats. So how safe should I or any other American feel about visiting Hong Kong in the future? Many are talking about, okay, so let me have the witnesses respond if anyone would care to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I can respond to that. It is true that China intends to apply this law extraterritorially, and I don't think anyone should feel particularly safe, particularly not if you have been involved at all in any sort of campaign for sanctions or other actions against the Chinese government or against Hong Kong. Because when you combine the provisions, Articles 36 to 39, together with Article 29, the definition of collusion with foreign forces, it creates an incredibly broad potential net for legal liability. So while I would have said up till a few years ago that Hong Kong is one of the safest places in the world to visit, because I lived there for 17 years and I always felt very safe, I don't think it's so safe for you to visit now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Engel. And I also would like to add on that, Article 38 stipulates very clearly that even if you have no Hong Kong residency and your conduct is conducted in places outside of Hong Kong, you will still be subject to the law. And I think it adds a lot of pressure and violation of human rights for journalists, academics, INGOs who might have criticized Chinese abuse of human rights before. And if they come to Hong Kong for international conference or their daily operation, they could be subject to that law. So I think it's extremely draconian, sweeping, and I think the international community should be very concerned about this law.
One more point to come in. I'm Cheuk Yan. As Carole and Taiping had already mentioned about that law applied to persons who is not a permanent resident of the region. And I would want to also point out that apart from, foreigner, if mainland Chinese support Hong Kong, which in the past, from the umbrella movement to the protest movement, there are some mainland Chinese who are already arrested inside China. But now, with this law passing, also the national security law would apply to, mainland Chinese who try to support human rights in Hong Kong. So it is not just applying to, of course, foreigner, so it's really catching on. Today, of course, our last governor, Chris Patten, had made some very good statement about the national security law. And I was wondering, actually, as the last governor of Hong Kong, can he come back to Hong Kong to visit us? No, maybe he would be, labeled as, foreign collusion with foreign power. and then in breach of the national security law. So once he come in, then he may have a problem. And so this is really a very wide, application of law to anyone in the world. Or so anyone in the world can be caught by this law. This is that it's this you can see the attitude of the Chinese Communist Party wanting to catch everyone.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you another question. Many are mentioning risks to personal safety for those who have been involved in the Hong Kong democracy movement from the days of the handover until now. Several of you speaking to us today has repeatedly put yourselves at great personal risk. You're very courageous, and I really take my hat off to you. We've seen announcements from the United Kingdom and from Taiwan regarding safe haven for Hong Kongers. So my question is, what can the United States do best to ensure that we're doing our part to welcome those in Hong Kong who face persecution under these new laws?
Well, thank you for your question, Chairman Engel. And first of all, I would like to express my gratitude that I understand that the U.S. government has also proposed a safeguard plan for a lot of human rights defenders in Hong Kong, including those who could have been indicted or have criminal records regarding the protesters. So I think this is indeed a great way to support Hong Kong protesters on the ground. For Hong Kong people, well, one thing I would like to mention is that after the day implementing the national security law, today there were more than 100,000 people marching down to the street, facing extremely high risk and police brutality, and also the risk of being imprisoned for more than 10 years on the street, and then to chant the slogan in support of freedom and democracy. I think this fearless attitudes towards the autocracy is very admirable. And I think not only offering safe vote plan for these people, but also the international community should join hands to implement more and more mechanisms to hold China accountable, so that we could let those people fighting on the ground feel more safe, and let the Chinese government more scared to implement more draconian execution of these laws again.
Thank you, Chairman. If I may speak on the issue, in addition to Nathan, I think it's a reality that we have to face. Some of the best and brightest Hong Kong protester intellectuals, academics have to flee the city because of their involvement in the democracy movement since 2019. It's very saddening, and it's unfortunate that many people are forced to seek refuge elsewhere, but it's a reality that we have to face. Many of my friends, myself included, have to make that same tough decision. So I know that in America now, two bills have been proposed. The first is Hong Kong Safe Harbor Act. Another one is Hong Kong Freedom and Choice Act. Those will provide the immediate refugee favorable policy to Hong Kong people. I think those will be a very good mechanism to ensure the safety of those who are really in danger and in great need. So I think those acts, I hope that they will be passed soon and would, create much more discussion around the human rights abuse situation in Hong Kong. Think about Hong Kong as an international financial city that produced a generation of exiles, a generation of political refugees. This is unacceptable, but we need to help them.
Thank you very much. Anyone else care to answer the question? If not, then we'll go to Mr. Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this important and extraordinarily timely hearing. Thank you to all of our witnesses, and thank you, Mr. Lee and Mr. Nathan Law, for the tremendous sacrifices you have made years to date, and the risk that you face now. Just a couple of points. Unless Xi Jinping reverses course, I think everyone has to be on notice in the world that every treaty obligation, including those with the WTO, that China has added its name to, its voice, its signature, are worthless. They made solemn obligations, freely entered into, and now they are breaking it with impunity. You know, we often talk about the rule of law. In China, it's the rule of unjust law. And I would say to Ms. Petersen, and I thank you for your testimony, your point on the retroactive, because I was thinking that as well. I think that is a technical omission in the law. Nothing precludes this dictatorship from looking back and holding people to account. It is just their way. Let me just ask a couple of questions. One, do you have a sense that the world will unite, particularly world leaders? There needs to be, I think, a very serious sanctions regime. You know, mention was made about the Secretary of State. He did on May 27th, pursuant to the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act language, he made a very strong statement that Hong Kong does not continue to warrant treatment under U.S. law in the same manner as before its handover. Of course, that's because of the autonomy issue as well as human rights. He stated that the administration would eliminate different and special treatment for Hong Kong, including export controls on dual-use technologies and more. And then a month later, on June 26th, Secretary Pompeo announced the imposition of visa restrictions, which we all were calling for those Chinese officials who are undermining the high degree of autonomy as guaranteed in the '84 Sino-British Joint Declaration. Obviously, more now has to be done, that they have pulled the trigger. My hope is that they will revisit it. Maybe our witnesses could speak to whether or not they think there's any possibility of that. But I would hope that the people around Xi Jinping realize that he is dishonoring the Communist Party. He is dishonoring the government of China, when all the world can see in the light of day that they give their word and they break it with impunity, and that's exactly what they're doing right now. I would also ask our witnesses, maybe they want to speak to corporations. Obviously, the reach of this law is far beyond just people physically residing in Hong Kong. They have put language in this decree, this law, that reaches beyond that. And let me just say there are a lot of members of this House and Senate. I'm among them. I was briefed by the FBI. I'm a target. That's what they put this out, and I'm a target, whatever that means. And I think this campaign of intimidation against the world, against people, especially the Hong Kongers, we need to meet this as never before. We didn't do it after Tiananmen Square. Herbert Walker Bush didn't do it, nor did Bill Clinton. We acquiesced, and they took note of that and said, you know, give it a little time and people will just let it go. And I think, as the speaker pointed out before, there are a whole lot of us on both sides of the aisle who really realize the nefarious nature of this dictatorship, and we need to really draw that line. And hopefully there are some people within the Xi Jinping government who will say, wait a minute, time out. You've gone too far, President Xi. You're doing it with genocide against the Uyghurs, as we've all talked about, and now you're doing it here. So if any of the witnesses would like to speak to any of those points. And let me just say to Nathan Law, you said don't look away. We will not look away. We will further engage. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I think first, again, we have talked about the Article 38, that is explicitly an intimidation against the global community for speaking up for Hong Kong. That's the first. And the second one, I think it's important to recognize CCP's strategy of political control is always about compartmentalizing politics. That, assuring the business community, you should not concern yourselves with politics. You will not be affected by the new law. But just recently, HSBC and Standard Chartered, two biggest banks in Hong Kong, were forced to kowtow explicitly to the national security law. It shows the division between business and politics is only a political expediency in the eyes of China, and it can always dissolve and force the business community to obey its law or to align themselves with the party interests. So I think it's really important to send a message that we should not fall into the divide and conquer tactic by CCP. So that's why I think not only US has to take a much tougher position, we also have to unite different nations in the world, such as the EU, which is the biggest exporter of China, such as the United Nations, different platform that Professor Petersen mentioned. So I think we have to come up with a counter-united front to Chinese own united front that want to conquer and divide the world.
Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. Mr. Lee, on May 29th, Trump announced that there'd be targeted sanctions against Chinese and Hong Kong officials, but he didn't provide any names or lists. They're just an illusion at this point. As you may be aware, I, along with the ranking member of the Asia Subcommittee, Mr. Yoho, introduced a House version of the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, introduced in the Senate by Senators Toomey and Van Hollen, to impose mandatory sanctions on entities that violate China's obligations to Hong Kong under the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, and also the banks that do business with them. What are Hong Kongers' positions on the U.S. implementing targeted sanctions, particularly targeted visa bans, in light of the national security law decision? Mr. Lee?
Yeah, thank you. I will fall into let me read the article on the collusion of foreign power. I will fall into that definitely for answering this question. I think this is the problem now. With that law in place, when you read through the law, and anything, suggesting anything to the international community, maybe, sort of catch you as collusion of foreign power. And one of the things that's very specifically targeted at is to sort of, there's an article on it inviting sanctions. I think that is exactly, what they really had in witness of what have happened in the past, and they would try to, stop people of Hong Kong or anyone in the world from sanctioning of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think I have to be, I leave it to your wisdom to how to, go about in the future to support Hong Kong. But one thing I want to mention is that when you look at the special United Nations mechanism, recently there's a very powerful United Nations 50 special rapporteur had joined together on a joint statement on China and Hong Kong.
I'm going to ask you to wrap it up. I do need to go on to another question.
Special rapporteur on Hong Kong and China.
Thank you. Taiwan, I'll build on the comments of our chair, Mr. Engel, as he points out that Taiwan and the United Kingdom are talking about opening their doors to hundreds of thousands or even millions of Hong Kongers. We want freedom for Hong Kong, not immigration from Hong Kong, but we have to deal with the practical situation as it stands. I'll be joining our colleagues, Mr. Curtis and Mr. Castro, in introducing in the House the Hong Kong Safe Harbor Act to designate Hong Kongers as Priority 2 refugees. This is necessary because Priority 2 allows the individuals to access our refugee system without going through the UNHCR, which doesn't have an office in Hong Kong, and doesn't without a referral from an NGO that China could block. Do Hong Kongers generally support the effort to make it easier for Hong Kongers to be classified as Priority 2 refugees? I wonder if Mr. Law could answer that.
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's important for us to provide a way out, not only for the ordinary protesters, but for those who have been heavily targeted, and especially under the national security law, that people who may face lifelong imprisonment, these politically targeted individuals, they are likely, the assistance for them are likely needed. So I think for now, yes, indeed, if there are more countries offering helping hands to them, that would be a better result for them. And they are not necessarily leaving, but at least they are offered choices for them to make, and for them that will ease a lot of their pressure.
I would point out that political activists from China dedicated to freedom have had a major and positive impact on the world, including, of course, Mr. Sun Yat-sen. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Perry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank our guests. The first question I think I have is regarding the agreement for people that are unfamiliar with maybe the specific tenets and the text of the agreement. What are, since obviously China and the Communist Party in Beijing have decided that they're not going to honor any of the commitments in the agreement, what are, if any, the remedies? And before you answer, before anybody answers, I just remind everybody that's listening, watching, that breathes a breath, this is the reason that you don't make agreements with nations or criminal organizations that have no intent on maintaining their side of the bargain, that are known liars. Organizations and countries like North Korea, like Iran, like China, like Russia. This is why you don't make agreements with them. You demand action, and then you have a reaction to their action. But with that, what are the remedies?
May I come in? The question about the Sino-British Joint Declaration, I think in that particular declaration, it was registered with the United Nations. But one problem with the whole Joint Declaration is that they don't have any so-called remedy clause for violation. Though recently, the European Parliament resolution, when you read through the text, there's one particular text that say that encourage the member states to go to the International Court of Justice and to seek remedy over the breaching of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. But of course, this is a suggestion, but whether legally you can do that, we still do not know. And of course, I think the UK government has a responsibility to make sure that the Sino-British Joint Declaration that they agree on should be respected. And now when it's a breach, they should be the one that really, go to the United Nations and ask for a respect of the Joint Declaration. But we hope that we will see something in the future about the Sino-British Joint Declaration.
Could I add something to that? Mr. Lee is correct that there's no clause in the Sino-British Joint Declaration providing for dispute resolution, but the General Assembly of the United Nations can always seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. And there's nothing that China could do to prevent them seeking that non-binding advisory opinion as long as a majority of the General Assembly voted to seek it. Just recently, in 2019, the ICJ issued an advisory opinion on whether decolonization was lawfully completed with respect to the Chagos Islands. And although the UK wasn't very happy that that request was made, it was made because a majority of the General Assembly voted for it. Now, even though advisory opinions are non-binding, they can be very influential. And I think even a campaign to seek a vote in the General Assembly to seek that advisory opinion would put some pressure on the Chinese government to be a little more careful about living up to the letter of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Thank you.
Hey, I sure appreciate your comments, and I got a news flash for everybody. Public pressure and opinions, non-binding, et cetera, have, as you can see, little effect on the Communist Chinese Party. So that's all just tilting at windmills, in my opinion. But let me ask this question. With the advent of this the security law in Hong Kong, what are the ramifications of this for, what do you see the ramifications for Taiwan?
Obviously, first, I thank you for the question. Obviously, the law actually applies to non-Hong Kong residents, including Taiwanese, right? And they're, on the one hand, they have been very active in supporting for Hong Kong. On the other hand, their own pursuit for democracy is also branded as subversion of the state power, right? So I think it also be a very good signal about how China will actually treat Taiwan, given Taiwan will one day to be succumb to the so-called one country, two system, right? So I think it shows how ambitious China will be one day once you fall into their agreement that they would not honor, as you point out. And I think, it obviously shift the discussion, what's happening is in Hong Kong shift tremendously the discussion in Taiwan, that they know that the CCP is not trustworthy and their so-called political arrangement, high degree of autonomy, et cetera, are mere lie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you very much. Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The national security law that Beijing drafted in secrecy and imposed on Hong Kongers will be swiftly used to suppress. Fact of the matter, it's already happening. I woke up this morning to reports that the police in Hong Kong have made at least one arrest today of a demonstrator for, quote, violating the national security law. As I read the testimony of our witnesses this morning, I felt a deep connection to the struggle for democracy described. I would be remiss if I didn't say right here in America, I am part of the continued struggle of Black Americans to realize the promise of democracy in this great nation. And I can identify with the lifelong nature of this kind of struggle. It is because of the history and present challenges for my community in America that I know we must care deeply about what happens in Hong Kong. History has shown us that the push for freedom, equality, and human rights is always connected anywhere it exists. It reminds me of the words of Dr. King when he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And while I thank this committee and the House of Representatives for standing up, I am so deeply disappointed in the faltering of the White House when it comes to its U.S. global standing. This is a moment for strong U.S. leadership, but it's also a moment where the president's geopolitical failures are emboldening China and other nations that now seek to press their agenda unchecked. It is no coincidence that China has chosen this point in time to blatantly disregard commitments it made decades ago to grant Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy. Congress has given the Trump administration the tools to address Chinese human rights violations. We have shown strong bipartisan support for Hong Kong and the resolve to hold China accountable. Instead of using these authorities, the President of the United States chose early on to praise Beijing's handling of protests in Hong Kong and did worse than nothing as the Chinese government vigorously oppressed the Uyghurs. As I have traveled to meet with world leaders since the 45th President of the United States took office, I've heard resounding concern about the increasingly erratic nature of American foreign policy. Our closest allies continue to see this as a problem, but others see it as an opportunity. China has emboldened to take the actions it has in Hong Kong, just as it's similarly emboldened on its borders with India, in the South China Sea, and increasingly to Prussia, Taiwan. So with that, I ask Ms. Petersen, in what ways can the United States redeem its credibility and work with the global community to get China to honor its international commitments? And what role, if any, can multilateral organizations play in this inflection point, at this inflection point? Ms. Petersen.
Thank you very much for that question. We could start by becoming more active in the UN human rights monitoring mechanisms, particularly the UN Human Rights Council, because since the United States has ceased to be active in that council, China has gained more influence on the council. And it's now served 3 terms on the Human Rights Council, and it recently secured an appointment to a very influential panel, plays a role in nominating independent UN human rights experts. So the United States needs to become active again in the UN Human Rights Council. The UN Human Rights Council has been asked by a group of independent human rights experts to establish a special rapporteur on human rights in China. And it would be nice if the United States would play a more active role in that campaign. The United States could also, of course, ratify more human rights treaties, because that would mean that we would be able to elect members, independent experts, to sit on those monitoring committees. Thank you.
Thank you. And also, I have a concern in regards to Hong Kong's status as a financial hub, and I'm concerned with the lack of strategic thinking by the administration that could limit Hong Kong's access to American dollars and markets. I'm wondering, Mr. Leung, do you anticipate any slippage in Hong Kong's financial system and trade standing, and what might that effect of that slippage be on the one country, two systems doctrine?
Thank you, Congressman. China has always taken advantage of Hong Kong's special economic status that is globally recognized, that is treated separately from China. But that recognition is conditional upon the fact that Hong Kong is sufficiently autonomous. So I think in future, the discussion around sanction is actually not so much about sanction. It's about withdrawing the privilege that the international community confer upon China, given it has honored its side of promises. Now it has completely ruined its side of promises and do not want to allow Hong Kong to enjoy high autonomy nor civic freedom. So I think withdrawing their privileges and negotiating until China is willing to honor its promises, I think we have to think about that economic privileges. Does that warrant the international recognition that China enjoys now and keeps benefiting from our special economic status?
Thank you very much. Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping have blatantly disregarded the agreement between Great Britain and China. The international agreement to allow for the self-rule and independent governance of Hong Kong has been washed away. The rioting going on today in Hong Kong is a direct result of Communist Beijing's lack of respect for rule of law and international agreements. It also shows the Communist Party is intimidated by people with free thought. Chinese communism cannot survive in a free society. Unfortunately, Xi's communists have brought shame to the Chinese people once more as he leads them into their second century of shame. It is agreed that Hong Kong is a province of China. The United Kingdom agreed in 1997 to cede its claim of the territory and return full control to China 50 years into the future, 2047. The Chinese leaders of the time accepted these terms in good faith. The rioting in Hong Kong, approaching a year now, is solely the results of Xi and the Communist Party breaking those agreements and is driven by the lust for authoritarian power and fear, the fear of, again, free-thinking people. In modern civil societies, there must be a mechanism or forum for people to address grievances to their government peacefully without fear of reprisal from the government. This is exactly what the people of Hong Kong attempted to do when Carrie Lam, Hong Kong's chief executive officer, introduced the now ill-fated extradition bill last year at the direction of China's Communist Party. The people of Hong Kong attempted to peacefully address their concerns, but their concerns fell on deaf ears. We now know why. Chinese communism cannot survive where people have free thought. Their goal, that is of the CCP, is to remove any form of democratic existence near its border. In essence, Beijing has broadcast to the world China and the communists are not to be trusted. The question is, what are international businesses operating in Hong Kong going to do? Will they put profit above international agreements? Will they place the concerns of their board members over human rights? Will year-end dividends and stock reports justify their operations, investments, and manufacturing to overlook actions approaching the atrocities of the Nazi regime inflicted upon millions of Jews, Czechs, Poles, and others? Let's hope not. Is China's assault on its province of Hong Kong a prelude to misguided actions against the sovereign nation of Taiwan. This fight in Hong Kong is not between China and the United States. It is a continual sad loop of human endeavors, a fight of right versus wrong, good versus evil, freedom against suppression. In the end, freedom will prevail. My questions to the panel: have any of you seen or heard personally any actions of the protesters to secede from China? Or is their concern only to have, of the protesters, to have rule of law with an independent judiciary system restored? Mr. Leung, we'll start with you.
Thank you for the question. I think in the eyes of the Communist Party, everything could be falling under the concepts of national security and secession. Once you go against the state, whether you speak it publicly, whether you demonstrate it, it can be construed in some way as subversion to the state power. When you look into the 2019 anti-extradition bill movement, the majority, the consensus is really about implementing the much needed institutional reform and much delayed reform in Hong Kong. I grew up in Hong Kong and have witnessed 23 years where we have not made substantive democratization progress in our legislative council, in which half of the seats are actually not democratically elected, not to mention our chief executive, who is the one to blame for the crisis since 2019 and still remain in power. It's staggering to think about a quarter of the population go against a government and that leader can still remain in power for many years. It shows that Chief Executive Carrie Lam now is a total pawn for the CCP to execute agenda rather than reflecting Hong Kong people's will and interests. So again, I think the whole movement up to now, the core consensus is really about initiating the much needed and much delayed institutional reform.
Thank you for your answer. I'm out of time, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sires.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me compliment my colleague from New Jersey for fighting always for human rights all these years and working with the Speaker on some of these issues for many, many years. You know, I worry very much about this whole situation for the people of Hong Kong and for the people of the rest of the world. I worry that if we do not send a strong response to Hong Kong, there are many people, many leaders in the Western Hemisphere that is looking at this and saying, well, if the Chinese did it in Hong Kong, I can do it here in Venezuela, I can do it here in Nicaragua, I can do it here in Cuba. So a strong response is very, very important, especially from this country. Going to the United Nations is also very important, but the response to China has to be strong, because we cannot let China set the example that they can do anything and they're going to get away with it. So I worry very much that they play the long game. I worry that they'll say, well, there'll be an upheaval in the world now, but we'll get away with this just like we have gotten away with this in the past. I worry about the administration's approach and the president's approach through transitional kind of politics that we are practicing now in this country. And there are many things that can be said that I think that haven't been said. So with that, I ask the panel, does this country now have the credibility to make strong statements of what is going on in Hong Kong? Anyone in the panel?
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think, of course. Hello, sorry. Nathan, you want to go?
You go. Your turn.
Yeah. On the question about, credibility, I think it's very important that, actions always speak more than words. And we want to see the support as I mentioned, in the United Nations and a lot of international community instruments and institutions to support Hong Kong. And we in Hong Kong, the other question that has already been asked is, what are we looking for? We are looking for democracy only. And we have been promised democracy. And for 23 years, we have been disappointed after the handover. And the disappointment is now, really stifling the hope of the people of Hong Kong. And we feel very disappointed that over many years, the world had not spoken against the broken promise of China.
And I'll just add, thank you for the question first. I'll just add, Hong Kong people are actually watching very keenly about what US is doing and has done. So I think action and words coming from US government from now on will be closely watched and will be in the deep interest of Hong Kong people. I think the first step to building credibility is, as Mr. Lee have said, is to build action, is to speak up for Hong Kong whenever there is a critical crisis and implement concrete policy from now on. So I think that credibility will be built.
Yeah, I think the support from the U.S. to Hong Kong democratic movement and our pursuit of freedom has always been very strong, bipartisan, and very vocally since last year. And for me, myself, I studied at Yale University last year, and I felt very encouraged that a lot of my fellow students, they came to me and vocally support for my pursuit and a lot of actions in Hong Kong. So I think it is not only about the government and not only about the bipartisan support in Congress, but for ordinary Americans, we have felt that they really are giving us enormous support, no matter on Twitter or some other platforms. So I think that kind of noise and vocal support is much needed, and I think it will encourage a lot of Hong Kong people when they feel alone and feel helpless when they face this giant authoritarian regime.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, I introduced the bipartisan Hong Kong Safe Harbor Act, along with my partner, Representative Castro, and other members of this committee, including Representative Sherman, Yoho, Kissinger, Malinowski, and others, and Smith. I want to pause and take note of the bipartisan nature of this bill and the strong bipartisan support. And I hope by doing so, those who are watching this hearing will take notice that we're committed as a Congress, regardless of party, to act on this. This bill would designate Hong Kongers as priority 2 refugees, streamlining the refugee admission process. This bill also sets up an asylum path for those in Hong Kong who are in immediate danger from the CCP, frontline activists, journalists harmed while covering the protest, first aid responders at the protest, anyone who provided legal service to those arrested for the protest, and anyone arrested during the protest since June 9th, 2019. The legislation also instructs the Secretary of State to work with like-minded ally countries to accept refugees from Hong Kong. This bill addressed the immediate humanitarian crisis. The U.S. must act fast. This legislation is needed, and it's needed immediately. I would also like to note that more legislation is in process, and I'd like to point out the good work of others on this committee, Representative Malinowski and others, and note that we have a lot of work to do. I hope the House will act quickly on this legislation. My question to the witnesses is that as I've listened to the propaganda regarding this bill, I frequently hear that it's a passive bill, that it will only be used in extreme circumstances, that it won't be exercised as feared. And I'd like their comments on that, and specifically since the law went into effect, I understand there have been arrests since then. And are you seeing any impact already of the bill? And is this passiveness that was promised simply propaganda?
Yeah, personally, I think it's not at all a passive bill. When you look at the way they, framed all the charges and about the institution that is going to enforce the bill is really very scary. Firstly, they have a national security supervisory body headed by the Communist Party back in China. And then they have a national security agency stationed in Hong Kong, cooperating with the police, of course, and with police personnel in the whole national security setup. And then the police will have the power to confiscate your computer, freeze your account, confiscate your passport. So all these are put into the law. So it's not at all passive. And they have the whole now create a whole national security agency institution in Hong Kong to enforce the law. So it's not at all passive. And now today, just today, 10 people have been arrested. Of course, 300 people have been arrested. But out of the 300 arrested, 10 of them was arrested for breaking the national security law. And so it is today already very active in arresting people in the demonstration that we have just today. And to add one more point, when you look at how the police enforce the law, they have already made, as I mentioned in my witness statement, a banner already, warning the people that you may be arrested with the national security law of secession and subversion. So it's not at all passive, and sadly, they are now already starting to take a very active role, we expect in the future, so that people of Hong Kong will be fearful of standing out for their rights and to be fearful for exercising our freedom.
Yeah, adding to the comments of Mr. Lee, I think not only about its execution, but its cultural impact towards the Hong Kong as a society is immense. The spokesperson of the Communist Party repeatedly said that there are a lot of incidents with really low thresholds that people could be violating the national security law, like you're saying certain slogans or you are circulating certain rumors that could kind of like create hatred towards the government, which it is really a fixed term. And also in today's 10 arrests, there are cases that individuals carrying banners or stickers without even displaying it when the police conducted stop and search, they were actually arrested in the names of national security law. So you could see how broad and how shallow the whole execution is. And I think it is not only about really getting people in jail, but also creating a white terror among the crowd to remind us that our rights are all being deprived and we can only listen to whatever Communist Party said.
Thank you. I'm out of time, and I appreciate the witnesses. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Connolly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel for being here, and thank you for your bravery to our Hong Kong friends who are with us today. I want to talk about two things, leverage and impunity. And I think the elephant in this room is the fact that the Trump administration has unilaterally given up leverage that would be profoundly helpful in the situation in Hong Kong. On human rights, the president is almost silent. He misses every opportunity to talk to foreign leaders about it, and in fact, is an enabler. Look at Saudi Arabia. Look at Russia. When it comes to international treaties, our moral high ground is compromised by our retreat, whether it be the Paris Climate Accord, whether it be the Iran nuclear agreement, whether it be the INF, or the fact that we still haven't signed the Law of the Seas, meaning we don't have much leverage in that body either, which really matters with respect to China. We talk about Mr. Castro's bill, a good bill to try to provide a relief valve for Hong Kong refugees. But this administration has limited the number of refugees. It cut the number from 110,000 to 20,000, and we're not even going to come close to that this year. It's made it's about to lay off 13,500 people who work for Immigration and Citizenship Services, making it impossible to naturalize or process asylum claims. And then with respect to China, we know from John Bolton, this president pled with President Xi, the man we're trying to influence to do the right thing, to help him with his reelection by buying U.S. goods and agricultural goods especially. Mr. Bolton says in the mass protests a year ago in Hong Kong, President Trump's reaction was, I don't want to get involved. And at one point he even praised President Xi's handling of it. Where's our leverage? Where's our moral high ground? We can say whatever we want here, but actions of this administration speak a lot louder than rhetoric. And then there's impunity, Chinese impunity. Professor Petersen, you talk a lot about international forums and human rights resolutions and using our influence to try to pressure the Chinese, but it seems to me the Chinese have decided it doesn't matter. They're acting with impunity against the agreement with the handover of Hong Kong, against international law, against international pressure on human rights. What is the leverage we've got, I ask you, Professor Petersen, and why do the Chinese operate with such clear impunity? And Mr. Law, you may want to comment on that as well.
Yes, thank you for that question. International law is inherently difficult to enforce. That's right. But I don't agree with you, sir, that China doesn't care at all about the human rights norms. And the reason I disagree is that I see the Chinese government investing a great deal of time and resources to become a more active participant in the UN human rights monitoring bodies and to try to shape the norms into a form that suits them. So we do see the Chinese government trying to, for example, intimidate treaty monitoring bodies so that they don't post shadow reports that are critical of the Chinese government. We see the Chinese government trying to...
Professor, if I could just interrupt because I don't have a lot of time. I'm not sure that proves your point. I think all that does is prove that China is using its leverage to completely dilute the effect of international law. Look at how they've ignored the ruling, which was decisive on the Philippines' rights before UNCLOS and the law of the seas and the arbitration panel. They've ignored it. They don't care. They've shown no interest in caring about that at all, other than to continue to try to dilute rulings of the body and to isolate those rulings when they don't come in their favor.
I accept your point on the case with the Philippines, but I still don't agree that it's worthless to invest time in the UN. The reason they have more leverage in the UN human rights monitoring system is that the United States has become inactive. And that's where I do agree with you. We have lost our leverage because we are not on that stage as much as we should be. And the truth is the United States has sometimes ignored rulings as well. I mean, we have not always accepted rulings of the International Court of Justice, even when they had jurisdiction in contentious cases. So I think no actor in the international stage is perfect, but if we want to help the people of Hong Kong, one way that we could help, in my opinion, is to be more active in the UN human rights monitoring system.
Mr. Chairman, could Mr. Law just respond to the impunity question? I, of course, yield back my time.
Certainly.
Yeah, I think, well, for decades, the world has been too lenient for China's violation in terms of trade agreement and in terms of international treaty. And for now, it is very difficult to find an international mechanism that could really hold them accountable from what we have now. So I think it is important that we recognize how China has been manipulating these leeways and treating like issues on China, on Taiwan or Hong Kong, Xinjiang, South China Sea, and also in India even, with huge disrespect for international norm. So I think this is not only about the current mechanism that we could use, but also the attitude of the countries around the world, especially those more liberal ones, how they could join hands to apply pressure and to support those on the ground in these places in regards to China's expansionist nature.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wright. Okay, Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I will say for the record, I'm going to miss you and your leadership. You've been a great leader of this committee in the short time I've been here, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I hope you consider me a friend, because I sure consider you one, brother. And you will be.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burchett.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Chinese officials in Beijing and Hong Kong have said this new security law will target an extremely small number of people. I don't believe anybody believes these officials. We cannot assume that the Chinese Communist Party will stay true to their word. The CCP has shown time and time again they are not to be trusted, and they play by their own set of rules. A few examples of that, I'm going to take my mask off a second. Attempting to cover up the origins of the COVID-19 by destroying forensic evidence, silencing doctors that dared to speak out, and failing to notify the international community over COVID as a whole. And they continue to bully their neighbors in the South China Sea with absurd claims of territorial rights over the Spratly Islands. Bloodshed along the line of the actual control with India, I think, is based on recent events, and we can probably say that China is to blame completely. They have forced over 1 million Uyghurs into prison camps. I've heard the reports go on that they're shocking. Forced abortions, beatings, torture, solitary confinement, and more. It honestly leaves you speechless, Mr. Chairman. But I don't know why we should expect any better of a group of people they're oppressing. They have a history of doing this to their own people. We need to call them out for these acts whenever and wherever they do it. Yesterday, pro-democracy political group, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, Demosisto, and 2 other independence groups dissolved with Hong Kong. Is this the point of no return for Hong Kong's democratic movement? And I'll ask our distinguished group that's gathered.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think it is important for us to recognize that any forms of disagreement with Beijing, or even in their own term, intrigue hatred towards them, could be considered a violation of the national security law. So basically, none of us could speak freely, because we can never guess when they will feel hated. So I think this is especially the case in Hong Kong for all the local political activists. We are basically chained for most of the occasion if we don't want to face lifelong imprisonment. So I think sometimes this is a white terror that they created. And for us, we really have to attest how their execution would be, how they will implement that law, and to adjust our way of conducting our activism. But I don't think this is the end of our movement, because as you could see, there are 3 Hong Kong activists sitting in this panel giving out testimony, and also there were more than 100,000 people marching down to the street. There are a lot of brave Hong Kong people who do not afraid the tyranny, and they still march down to the street regardless of the intimidation from them. So I think Hong Kong movement is pretty much still alive, and with its tenacity. And I think the international community should really treasure and admire this group of brave people that give us back in this darkest time.
Any of the others?
Actually, I'm the chair of the Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic movement in China that is founded in '89, and we have been, fighting for democracy for China and of course Hong Kong over the past 31 years. And every day I was asked by the journalists whether we would dissolve our organization because of the national security law. Why they are asking that? Because we have of course, we have the platform of bringing justice to those who ordered the massacre in Tiananmen Square. We have the platform of end of one-party rule and also building a democratic China. So people are always asking us whether the end of one-party rule will be something that will be caught by the national security law as undermining the system of China. We do not know, to be honest. But we have told all the journalists, the media, that we will hold on to our principle and we will not retreat. Though we do not know what lies ahead of us, but I think it's very important that we believe in democracy and we should practice our belief. And so we do not know what lies ahead, and we will. And people also ask me, because we have the June 4th Museum, there's a lot of artifacts inside, whether we will, deliver it out of Hong Kong to somewhere safe. No, we are not going to do that. We will still stay on and practice what we have, all the activity we will continue to conduct as in the past. But as you said, we do not know when we can return victorious to democracy.
Thank you. I've run over time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I hope we continue to support free people everywhere. And I think if we're finally going to take care of this problem, we just got to stop buying Chinese junk, and we got to stop putting up with their garbage. And we got to, and talk is cheap, and we need to put something behind all this talk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I appreciate your friendship, brother.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to thank each of the witnesses for their testimony, as well as their continued bravery and advocacy and support for the people of Hong Kong. We're grateful to those of you especially who took risks by appearing here today. This national security legislation is just one more example of the political persecution, suppression of human rights and pro-democracy groups and civil rights lawyers and religious groups conducted by the government of China. In Tibet, we've seen cultural genocide to control the desire for Tibetan self-determination. We've seen the cruelty in Xinjiang, where Uyghur Muslims are surveilled, their phones hacked to trace their movements, conversations, and networks both in and out of the country. They're forced to provide blood samples, voice prints, facial scans, and other personal data, all before being thrown into mandatory re-education camps designed to suppress the Uyghur language and culture, transforming Xinjiang into a virtual police state. And just today, Hong Kong police arrested protesters under the new law for crimes yet to be divulged, and we must ask ourselves, what's next? Who is next? The Communist Party in China has grown more ambitious in ways that are anathema to democratic values and the rule of law, normalizing and enabling environments for the breakdown of civil rights and liberties. And in spite of Beijing's increasing encroachment in freedoms, we stand with the people of Hong Kong for their bravery and their courage to advocate for their freedoms. When the freedom and democracy of future generations are at stake, we have no choice but to speak up and to act. But it cannot come simply from this Congress. There is no doubt that the Speaker of the House, Speaker Pelosi, who chose to spend time with us today, is committed to fighting for human rights. She's been doing it for 30 years, and there is no doubt that my friend, Mr. Smith, has likewise been standing up for human rights everywhere in the globe, and he's been doing it for 30 years. But the leadership also needs to come at the top. And we're having this hearing today even as we're struggling to understand how the president's former national security advisor wrote of the president stressing the importance of farmers and increased Chinese purchases of soybeans and wheat in the electoral outcome, and, quote, pleading with Xi to ensure he'd win, close quote. And then also the former national security advisor said that at a G20 meeting in June 2019, Xi had explained to Trump why he was basically building concentration camps in Xinjiang, and according to our interpreter, Mr. Bolton said, Trump said that Xi should go ahead with building the camps, which Trump thought was exactly the right thing to do. The National Security Council's top Asia staffer, Matthew Pottinger, told me that Trump said something very similar during his November 2017 trip to China. That also from the former National Security Advisor, and even on Hong Kong. The president said, after a quarter of the population of Hong Kong turned out for weeks of protests, the president said, I think President Xi of China has acted responsibly, very responsibly. They've been out there protesting for a long time. I hope that President Xi will do the right thing, he said, adding China could stop the protests if they wanted. I want to commend the State Department for its May 28th joint statement with the governments of Australia, Canada, and the UK, loudly opposing Beijing's imposition of national security law on Hong Kong. But I am so troubled at the way the president has conducted the relationship, his relationship with President Xi, in all of the ways that I just laid out that so clearly contradict the great bipartisan commitment to standing up for the human rights of the people of China, and today especially people of Hong Kong, that we've seen exhibited here in this committee. Mr. Law, if I can just ask, the United States clearly has to work with like-minded countries. What more can be done, should be done, with the United States leading the way in a multilateral effort to respond to this new law, the imposition of this new law? What can be done?
Thank you very much, Congressman, for your question. I think for now, as we have pushed forward multiple bills concerning Hong Kong situation, that we indeed need a strong action to implement them and to see what we can do to hold China accountable. Because for the past few years, we've been pushing forward Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and I'm glad that it was passed last year, end of last year. And we've seen a lot of upcoming bills that were going to be passed and will be pending to have effect on them. And I think this is an important process to show the world that even the US or the Western world, when they are dealing with China, they no longer see trade or business interests as their priority, but for human rights and for the pursuit of freedom. So these like-minded countries, I think, well, adjusting their priority and getting an agenda right is the most important thing that we could expect. And we would definitely feel encouraged if these countries are doing it with, well, a very obvious faction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Law. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Mrs. Wagner.
I thank the chairman and certainly our witnesses for bringing attention to China's attempt to bully and intimidate Hong Kong into abandoning its rights and freedoms. Hong Kong's success as a free and open city exposes the injustices and hypocrisies of the communist system in China. Congress stands in unity, in bipartisan unity with Hong Kong residents as they fight to protect rule of law and respect for human rights in their city. Yesterday, the Standing Committee of China's National People's Congress formally approved the national security law in time for it to go into effect today on July 1st, the anniversary of Hong Kong's handover to China. This is a date of great significance for pro-democracy advocates in Hong Kong. Ms. Petersen, I think we know how this new law has affected the annual July 1st protests, sadly, but how should the United States respond to these violent crackdowns on protesters?
Thank you for that question. Well, I think obviously we should be condemning it. We should join multilateral groups at the United Nations to condemn it. We should become more active in the UN Human Rights Council, which is being asked to set up an independent monitoring mechanism. And I fully agree with everyone who has suggested the Safe Harbor Act, because I think it is a very strong and significant show of support, more than just talk, to tell people that you will provide safe harbor if they have to flee an authoritarian regime. I want to say one brief thing about the statements that this law will only be enforced against a small number of people. I think that was Carrie Lam's hope, because she really hoped that everyone would be so frightened by this law that everyone would stay at home. And that's one of the reasons the law was brought into force during the COVID restrictions, because it makes it easier for the Hong Kong government to try to persuade everyone to stay home. But clearly that hasn't been the case. I think that there will be far more arrests than perhaps Carrie Lam had predicted. And the big question will be whether the people are tried in Hong Kong, where I do think the judiciary is still independent, or whether the mainland will use Article 55 to bring them to the mainland for trial, which would really be a terrible violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration.
Thank you, Ms. Petersen. More than just talk, I think, is the operative word there. The Communist Party's move to impose this national security law on Hong Kong seems to be inspired in part by domestic instability stemming from the party's catastrophic handling, as you just mentioned, Ms. Petersen, of the coronavirus pandemic. And I just came from the China Task Force, where I presented a Compensation for Americans Act piece of legislation that I hope we can move forward. Mr. Lee, do you expect discontent at home could push an unstable Beijing to take even more shocking actions against the people of Hong Kong?
Thank you for the question. We expect that the Communist Party of China will, be more high-handed in the way they try to, in a way, suppress the protest. But still, the people come out. I think we all have to appreciate the courage of people all marching out today during July 1st. And they have actually two, instruments of suppression. One is the national security law, but actually they have used another law that is, which is a draconian law in the British colonial time, and then they changed it during 1997 to make it more harsher. It's a public security ordinance. And I personally was charged for 7 charges for 4 incidents or marches under the public security ordinance, because now they're using the excuse of COVID-19 and saying that they will ban all gatherings. And so when we want to organize, all of you witnessed the 1 million and 2 million marches back in June last year. Now it's totally impossible to do that now.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Real quickly, China seems to have accelerated the timeline for passing and implementing the national security law in order to turn the tide against pro-democracy candidates at September's Hong Kong Legislative Council elections. I don't know if you have time to answer, because my time's about out, Ms. Petersen, but how do you anticipate the national security law will impact the makeup of Hong Kong's Legislative Council? What actions can the international community take to protect the pro-democracy movement this September?
Thank you for that question. Well, very briefly, I do anticipate that the Beijing and appointed Hong Kong government will try to use this law to disqualify pro-democracy candidates from running for office. I think the democracy movement is being very careful to try not to violate the law, or at least to make sure that there are candidates who can still stand, but it's going to be very difficult. I think they will try to use it as a pretense for disqualifying them. Thank you, Ms. Petersen. My time's expired. I appreciate the indulgence of the chair, and I want to thank Chairman Elliott for his leadership on this committee and here in Congress. It is an honor to serve with you, sir. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Wagner. Very much appreciated those very kind words. Thank you. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our extraordinarily courageous witnesses for being here today for this really important hearing. And while it is comforting to know that there is strong bipartisan support for human rights on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Congress of the United States, I think we have to recognize that the President's policy toward China has undermined American leadership and called into question, frankly, decades of strong bipartisan support for Hong Kong. And the American policy toward Hong Kong should, of course, be based on advancing the interests of our own country in supporting autonomy and democratic freedoms for Hong Kong. But we know, of course, that just a few months ago, the president wanted a trade deal and couldn't offer President Xi enough praise or deference during those negotiations and subsequent to them. We also know now there's new reporting that the president also sought assistance in his re-election campaign from the Chinese and supported the Chinese government's efforts to continue to put Uyghurs in concentration camps, and actually praised President Xi's handling of earlier protests in Hong Kong. So my first question is, despite strong, clear bipartisan support for democracy and freedom in Hong Kong, how does the president's conduct and his failure to speak out in support of human rights broadly, and then the specific effort to coddle the Chinese president and advance his own political interests, how does that impact what's happening in Hong Kong, how the Chinese government responds to protests in Hong Kong, and any of the witnesses who can provide an answer to that would be helpful. Mr. Law, maybe you can start.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it is important that we have a stable and strong alliance, including the cooperation from the Congress and the White House, that when there are resolutions passed in the Congress, then we could swiftly implement it. So I think it is important that we need a more or less volatile government to really handle these cases. But I think sometimes it's strategic, and I think most importantly, the structural direction towards China, a more assertive and a more an attitude that holds China accountable, has already established. So I think for long term, I'm not worried that this kind of consensus between aisles will fade.
Thank you. Mr. Kai-ping, could you speak to how you think the Chinese government will use this new law? Again, it's not a security law. It's a law of repression of dissent. It's a law to destroy democracy in Hong Kong. There was, it's already been reported, the first arrest this morning under this new law for a gentleman holding a Hong Kong independence flag. And so what should we expect to see in terms of the imposition or the use of this new law?
I think on two levels, you can see the impact that is immediate on Hong Kong. First, I think there is a pervasive sense of self-censorship that political parties have to, in advance, disband themselves. Netizens online have to self-censor their content, and protesters no longer will be able to enjoy the civic freedom to express political beliefs and hanging a political flag or slogans. I think those very pervasive intrusion to civil liberty that we have enjoyed over many decades is now under grave threat. And I think the second level is really about the institutional presence of the CCP in Hong Kong, that their office could now basically is about the law. Their operation is not bound by basic law, not bound by Hong Kong government. There's no way to hold them accountable. They could do surveillance, they could intercept information, they could do secretive arrests of protesters and then extradite them to China. So the law is really comprehensive in the sense, and its presence is pervasive in every corner of civil society.
Thank you so much. My final question is, I know that speaking out and condemning this conduct of the Chinese government is something we all will do, and a purpose of this hearing is to shine a light on it. I know many have suggested moving forward with sanctions, which of course is appropriate. But my final question is, are there other things, other actions we should be taking, both as the United States and along with partners around the world, our allies, that will have a meaningful impact on the Chinese government in terms of their efforts to destroy the democracy of Hong Kong? And if so, what are they?
Well, I think at least for now, well, the problems in Hong Kong is not only about Hong Kong, it's about how China will continue its authoritarian expansion of nature. So I think we could think of something like targeting its Winter Olympics, upcoming Winter Olympics, and also issues not only happening in Hong Kong, but happening elsewhere, like Xinjiang and Taiwan, in order to pile up the pressure and to coordinately apply pressure and let them to be aligned with the international norm and international ruling.
Thank you
and
so
if
much.
I may add to that, I think, do we have time? Sorry.
Sure, as long as the chairman will let you answer.
Yes, yes, certainly.
If I may add, I think the world now has to reckon with a recent China that is economically very powerful. And I think the world has to formulate a very stable, cohesive, and multilateral policy towards China, especially on terms of trade and business conducting. There are still U.S. companies who operate in Xinjiang or Uyghur region, and we have to take into account human rights issue when dealing with China in economic front, especially the issue of Hong Kong.
Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, I too want to thank you for your extraordinary leadership of this committee. You have been a mentor from the day that I arrived in Congress and had the privilege of serving on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I will be forever in your debt, and thank you for your great friendship and your service to our country. And I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cicilline. Very much appreciated. Thank you. Mr. Watkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panelists for your bravery. The Chinese Communist Party poses a serious threat, not just to the United States, but international interests. This is Chinese government, clearly not the Chinese people. The CPC is problematic, and many Chinese people have immigrated to the United States. They're welcomed, obviously. I'm biased because I married one. But the CCP for decades has been using meticulous and multidimensional strategies to degrade and undermine American hegemony and democracies around the world. Chairman Xi has accelerated these efforts, most recently and clearly apparent in CCP's dealings with Hong Kong. Obviously, CCP has violated the promise of one country, two systems by clamping down on Hong Kong, and they have shown a blatant disregard for human rights. The mass detention of millions of Uyghurs, forced sterilization, presumably of tens of millions of women over the past 30 years, and not allowing the freedom of speech. Chinese citizens who criticize the government are disappeared. Most recently, we've seen that play out during the coronavirus, where now the world has over 10 million cases and 500,000 deaths. They didn't share life-saving information. They covered up how infectious and dangerous the disease was. They didn't report human-to-human transmission for a month, and they censored anyone trying to warn the world. And let some 5 million people leave Wuhan without screening. They destroyed samples, they hoarded PPE, and they blamed the United States soldiers. So they have not been a good actor with regards to coronavirus. And with regards to national and regional disruption economically, they have stolen hundreds of millions of dollars in intellectual property from the United States. They force technology transfer, and they interfere with global supply chains, economics, and international business. So countering the CCP's aggression, thankfully, we've got a president who will hold the CCP account. An American president, unlike any other in history, will be tough on China. Republican leader Kevin McCarthy has established the China Task Force, spearheaded by this committee's own ranking member, Mike McCall. It's clear that we must steer the U.S. in a direction that is less dependent on China economically and in terms of manufacturing. And so my questions to Mr. Law, who, sir, you understand the United States very well. You went to Yale University. I represent Eastern Kansas. What do Kansans need to know about the situation? What can I take home to tell my constituents?
Well, I think when we talk about human rights and also the human rights violation in Hong Kong, we have to understand that we're actually facing a global fight. We've seen a lot of, for example, in the general election in the U.S., there are a lot of foreign forces getting infiltration and also manipulating a lot of misinformation campaign. And the same happens in Hong Kong. So actually, I think in the US and in Hong Kong, we both share a lot of things that are originated from authoritarian powers like Russia and in like China. So I think for me, my greatest target is to educate more US citizens to understand that we are actually in a global fight. We should hold hands together and to suppress these authoritarian expansionists, and to let us know that fighting for democracy, especially in Hong Kong, in this foreground, is indeed helping the world to preserve its democracy and its values.
Okay, thank you. To any of the other panelists, I've been to Hong Kong. I love Hong Kong. How will the future be different in the next 5 or 10 years because of the CCP?
I don't think anyone can, tell the future. Of course, we hope that freedom and democracy will return to Hong Kong, but I think we are into very, very difficult times. And not just us, but I think the whole China, everyone will, under Xi Jinping authoritarian regime, who only preaches about nationalism without really caring about the people, I think we are into hard times. But I want to also mention one thing about, people-to-people exchanges that Nathan had just mentioned, educating the American public about the situation in Hong Kong. And one thing that I think the Communist Party also in the national security law also mentioned about foreign NGO, and I think they also want to intervene into how these exchanges go on. But I think we should be it's very important and very encouraging to the people of Hong Kong that these exchanges continue.
If I may just add last word about how do we want to speak to American audience. I think we have to recognize Chinese influence is not only about Hong Kong, it's also about people around the world. We think, let's talk about Zoom. An app that has been used in American campus that explicitly censor Chinese activists. We can talk about disinformation campaign of China on Twitter, on Facebook, social media platform that are owned by China and censor sensitive information, such as TikTok, which is widely used by American teenagers. So I think we have to recognize the global influence of China is actually infiltrating to every corner of the world, and every citizen, even in America, will be affected.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the bravery of the panelists. I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Watkins, and I'll now recognize myself. The Chinese government is not only violating the rights of Hong Kongers, but also violating an international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration. This again undermines the credibility of the Chinese government when it comes to public pledges and international agreements. The national security law is part of a larger campaign of increased aggression from China in recent months, from its clashes with India and Vietnam to its bullying of Taiwan and increased repression of the Uyghurs. I believe China has been emboldened by the fact that no one is minding the shop at the White House. President Trump has consistently failed to hold China accountable on a range of issues and has in fact demonstrated no interest in doing so, specifically on human rights. Last summer, President Trump adopted the Chinese government's language by calling Hong Kong's peaceful protests riots. He also promised President Xi from the beginning that he would not get involved in Hong Kong in a misguided attempt to win concessions on China in trade talks. That strategy, like most of President Trump's, failed and is now costing the folks in Hong Kong. I joined Representative Curtis in introducing a bipartisan, bicameral bill, the Hong Kong Safe Harbor Act, that would expedite the process for Hong Kongers being persecuted to seek refugee status in the United States. This is a common sense policy that will protect the protesters who inspired so many of us for their dogged commitment to upholding universal human rights in the face of a very repressive regime. We also must work with our allies, such as the United Kingdom and Taiwan, in protecting Hong Kongers who now face retaliation by mainland Chinese forces. With that, I have a few questions. And as I mentioned, Mr. Curtis and myself, along with other members of this committee, introduced a bill yesterday that would give Hong Kongers who face persecution an easier path to receive refugee status in the United States. Can any of the witnesses speak to whom in Hong Kong is most at risk of being targeted by the Chinese and being persecuted because of the national security law? Should the United States pay special attention to student leaders and other specific groups? And I ask that question of anyone on the panel.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the question. I think since 2012, I think Hong Kong has seen a wave of youth-led movement. We have Joshua in 2012. We have a group of student leaders coupled with other seniors in civil society who led the umbrella movement. And now the anti-extradition bill movement in 2019 also subsequently involved a lot of young protesters. So I think party leaders, for example, Nathan, Joshua, are under tremendous pressure by the CCP. I think those political leaders from our generation do need certain protection, but also just other activists who have been first aider, who have been legal consultant, who have been, just reporting news. They would also be under pressure under the national security law.
Okay. Anyone else on the panel?
And I think about the young protesters and all the protesters that have been arrested over the past year, there are already 9,000 arrested and 2,000 of them prosecuted under the law. And many of them are prosecuted under the law of the crime of so-called crime of riot. And that may end up in 4 years to 6 years or even more years jail term for them. But very often what happens is not that they have any action in the scene. It's just that they have not left it. And then the police define that as a scene of riot. And then they are caught by the police. And then they may be sent to jail for 4 years. So it's not just a national security law in the future. What I want to say is also the protest movement in the past had already lots of persecution through these draconian laws called the public security ordinance. So I think in the future and the past, these victims of police brutality and police harassment and prosecution, unfair political prosecution should be the one that should be supported and with this new bills that are going to be introduced.
All right, thank you. I'm going to keep myself on time here, and thank you for your answers. I'm going to go to Ms. Titus of Nevada.
Oh, there we go. Well, thank you very much. Most of the hearing has focused on just this particular law and the context of the COVID virus. But as you just said in these last two speakers, this really isn't new. It goes back to 2014 with the umbrella movement, with the umbrellas against the tear gas when they appointed the first special executive. Then last summer, I was in Hong Kong. We saw the early protests against the extradition law. That was withdrawn, but certainly some of the other demands weren't. But throughout all of that, Carrie Lam said, well, we still have the one country, two systems. That seems to now be out the window. There doesn't seem to be much a pretense that that still exists. So I wish you all would elaborate maybe on how we should have maybe seen this coming. And then second question, because of my own background, I wonder what the impact of this is going to be on universities, students, academics, professors in Hong Kong, because the way the law is defined where it says subversion of state power, terrorist activity, collusion. Those are very broad terms that can be applied just about any way the regime wants to, and that would certainly target, I would think, professors and students in the social sciences.
Yep. Thank you for the question. If I may just address the second part of your question. I myself is in academia, and a lot of Hong Kong intellectuals, whether they're young or whether they're more senior, are extremely worried about their future. They worry about whether they could conduct independent research. whether their previous work will be scrutinized and used as evidence against themselves. And also not only about local academics, even scholars in America, because the law is so pervasive that it also covers American citizens. Academics who study on China or Hong Kong are very worried about their future. Would they be able to enter Hong Kong safely for future conference or research, or not to mention China, right? So I think academics is under tremendous pressure under this law, and a lot of self-censorship will happen. And lastly, to go back to your first part of the question, you rightly point out that it's not a new phenomena. If you look at 2014, Xi Jinping actually issued a white paper on the formulation of one country, two system policy. And it's explicit that the CCP under Xi Jinping's leadership is about total control. It's about party dominance. It's about what they call overall jurisdiction. So we should take into account the historical trajectory of CCP changing its formulation of one country, two system, completely different from the era in Deng Xiaoping, for example, about Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. No. Xi Jinping said it's about the party ruling Hong Kong. It's about a party who control every sector of Hong Kong.
Thank you.
Well, do you mind I jump into the second part of the question? Because I think it is important that we have witnessed a lot of suppression and worries from the local community, and a lot of scholars or students. They are really worried that whether they have academic freedom in Hong Kong. So actually, a lot of them are seeking opportunities to study abroad or work overseas. So, well, I had the experience of talking to them, and I think sometimes if we, like, for example, in a school, if they provide scholarship, that they could single out Hong Kong as a region from China and give them separate quotas, then it will facilitate them to be able to get these funds and to study abroad and continue their career as a scholar. And I think this is important because, well, in the US, we've got a lot of, well, speculations about whether there are covert missions from the Chinese students, whether they are guided by their party. And sometimes there are a lot of vacancies on the grants which are supposedly given to them, but for now stopped because of political reasons. And these funds could be transferred to Hong Kong students who are like brilliant in every terms, but being suppressed because of their political beliefs. So I think this is one thing that we could support them locally, and then to culture them in a free space, and they could, well, kind of like repay back to Hong Kong with their own terms.
Maybe we need to look at that specifically as we think about sanctions or safe harbors, to not forget about that whole student, academic, faculty, researcher population. Anybody else?
Yeah, just one more point. You know, the way the Communist Party, they are having a multi-pronged attack over the civil society, across, including university, academic, and also secondary school teachers. So they will, because they blame everything on the teachers about what the behavior of the youth. But actually, of course, the youth is leading the movement, not leading academics. But one thing they will do in the future, in every aspect of Hong Kong life, is they will put political loyalty above anything. You know, any profession that you may be very, very, you know, sharp and outstanding in the profession. But if you are not politically loyal, then they would not, you know, hire you in the academic field, civil servant, every aspect of life. They want only one thing: loyalty to the Communist Party.
All right, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. I'm going to go to Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I unfortunately didn't hear all the questioning here because I'm the ranking member of the House Small Business Committee, so I just came from a hearing there. So if I repeat anything that others have already asked, I apologize in advance. But I'd open this question up to any of the witnesses who might like to respond. I'm one of the founding co-chairs of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, and I'm currently co-chair of the caucus as well. So I'd ask that based on the Chinese Communist Party's decisions relative to Hong Kong with the national security law, what should we expect China's next move against Taiwan potentially to be, and what should Taiwan learn from Hong Kong's experience. And I, again, yield to any of the witnesses who might like to respond.
Thank you for the question. Petersen, Professor Petersen, do you want to jump in?
I would just say very briefly that I think Taiwan already knows that one country, two systems was not going to be fulfilled. It was originally developed for Taiwan. And sometimes people used to say when I first moved to Hong Kong in 1989 that Taiwan was Hong Kong's insurance policy because the Chinese government would want to show Taiwan that it will keep its promises. But clearly that hasn't happened. And I don't even think that China is trying to take any sort of soft diplomatic approach to Taiwan anymore. They're just trying to scare Taiwan.
Thank you very much. Any of the other witnesses want to weigh in?
Thank you for the question. I think in recent years, there has been tremendous interaction and exchange of Hong Kong and Taiwanese civil society. And Taiwanese activists and commoners that I've heard actually learned tremendous deal of how CCP ambitions and ideology about control, how dominant, one country, two system can be, once implemented in Hong Kong. So I think I agree with Professor Petersen that it shows that one country, two system is a broken promises that could not be implemented in Taiwan. The last year anti-extradition bill movement have helped tremendously to sway the discussion in Taiwan about how should we perceive China. And I think China would not give up the ambitions towards Taiwan or Hong Kong. And I think they would try to exert that national security concept to Taiwan via, if not formal legislation, some informal institution and informal channel of influence.
Thank you very much. Let me go to another question. What should the international community, specifically the United States, do to impose real consequences on the CCP for suppressing freedom in Hong Kong while minimizing any blowback or any consequences or any hardships on the people of Hong Kong itself, who we obviously want to help and stand with. We don't want to make their lives any more challenging than they already are. But what's the best way to impose a hardship for the bad behavior of China without harming the people of Hong Kong? And again, to any witness who might like to take that.
Thank you for the question. Again, China has used Hong Kong as a conduit to import sensitive technology, to finance its companies who are in tremendous debt, to conduct, let's say, IPOs of their national champions in Hong Kong. So China has benefited tremendously from Hong Kong as a gateway to international finance, to a gateway to international technology, especially from America. So those are spheres where America can exert tangible influence on China. And without a democratized parliament or institution, actually, Hong Kong people have not benefited tremendously from those economic arrangements. So the consensus in Hong Kong now is basically we have to hold China accountable and stop them from abusing our special economic status. So I think the support is actually there for U.S. to implement more tangible sanction on China.
Thank you. And I'll get in one last question if I can. One of Hong Kong's principal strength, obviously, is that it's such a great place to do business. If any of the, maybe one of the witnesses could discuss whether this new national security law will have a chilling effect on businesses and their international employees over and above any political activity.
Well, thank you very much. A lot of my friends are professionals, and they are all thinking about leaving Hong Kong. And also, I've talked with some business stakeholders. They are also thinking about stop moving into Hong Kong or stop injecting more funds until Hong Kong is more stable. So I think it is important to realize that we're not the ones who are harming Hong Kong or creating economic difficulties for Hong Kong, but the Chinese Communist Party. They're actually destroying Hong Kong as a city that could embrace different values and different opinions. And this is really vital for business. So I think, yes, indeed, we are suffering much from the implementation of national security law.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. I recognize Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for their continued commitment and courage in speaking out on behalf of the people of Hong Kong. We are all aware that we're in a contest with the Chinese Communist Party, a contest of ideas, and unfortunately for the people of Hong Kong, they are playing a role similar to the people of Berlin during the Cold War. This is a battleground in that contest, and we cannot underestimate how important this is and how difficult it is going to be, given the determination of Beijing to crush the freedom of the people of Hong Kong. My focus has been on what can we practically do about it. I strongly support targeted sanctions, but to be frank, I don't think they are going to do much good in terms of deterring the Chinese government from these actions. I think more important, as Mr. Leung mentioned, is to take action to withdraw some of the privileges that corporations doing business in Hong Kong currently receive. That's a difficult conversation we're going to have to continue to have. We've spoken also a lot here today about the importance of offering safe haven for people from Hong Kong, and I think that's incredibly important. And I want to make sure we're all clear. We have two pieces of legislation that I think are equally important. Mr. Curtis, Mr. Castro, and others have offered a piece of legislation that I have co-sponsored to provide expedited refugee status for activists, for people in Hong Kong who have a credible fear of persecution. That is a lifeline for the people who need it the most. A number of us, including myself, Mr. Curtis as well, Mr. Phillips, Mr. Kinzinger, Mr. McGovern, have offered an additional piece of legislation, the Freedom and Choice Act, which is meant not only as a lifeline but as a warning to Beijing, because in that legislation we also offer admission to the United States to people from Hong Kong with advanced degrees, business owners, those who have completed undergraduate degrees in the United States. The idea here is very simply to say to the Communist Party of China that if you indeed suffocate and crush Hong Kong, you will lose its wealth and talent to the United States. You will lose its wealth and talent to what you consider to be your greatest adversary, and frankly, your loss will be our gain. The point here is, again, not just to provide a lifeline, but a warning in order to try to deter Beijing from doing its worst to Hong Kong. And I wanted to ask the witnesses about this combination of efforts, and particularly whether they think that that warning might have some impact on Beijing's calculations, because after all, they want Hong Kong because of its wealth and talent, and we know they are very worried about the brain drain to the United States, to the United Kingdom, to Canada, to Australia. Mr. Leung, let me begin with you. Do you believe that this kind of action might be noticed in Beijing and might actually affect its calculations?
Well, definitely, I think Beijing is under huge pressure, and that's why they wanted to implement the national security law in order to try to squash the movement in Hong Kong. But in effect, it actually reignites the whole movement. We've got a lot of people coming down to the street to protest, and they are obviously not afraid of the newly implemented national security law. So I think actually, well, Beijing backfired himself, and I think for the international community, we should have a multilateral, comprehensive, and cohesive strategy dealing with China issue, not only in Hong Kong, but also, for example, they will have a Winter Olympic really soon, and shall we endorse that? Shall we participate in that? If we are not, then what message could we deliver in order to hold China accountable? And I think this is important that we put this kind of angle, looking at China issue in every respect, in every perspective, including the human rights violation in Xinjiang, the implementation to Taiwan, the cultural genocide in Tibet. So I think, yes, indeed, China is really pressured, but we have to push far more than only words. But we need coalition, we need alliance, and we need multilateral and comprehensive actions to them.
Thanks. Anyone else just quickly want to chime in on whether offering admission to the United States?
I want to talk about the business, not to succumb to pressure from the Chinese Communist Party in suppressing human rights in China or Hong Kong. And one example, I think Kai-Ting had mentioned about Zoom. Actually, I'm the victim of being blocked. My account was being blocked by Zoom. And afterward, apart from me, two other activists in America, because of our June 4th involvement and our forum on June 4th, our account was blocked. And then the explanation is that because the Chinese government had asked them to block our account. And then the answer to the query of the media is that, okay, in the future, they won't block our account, but they will block all Chinese participants. This is the way that the businessman behavior. The same with the HSBC, willing to sign on to the national security law. So business had to be held also, responsible for human rights violation in many parts of the world and not to support a regime that suppress human rights.
Sure. If I may just add very quickly about the issues of
Sure. You want to for about 10 seconds?
Actually add substantive pressure on China. For example, the UK, when they mentioned about favorable opening of the BNO, actually, it was met with severe criticism from the Foreign Affairs Department from Chinese company, from Chinese government. For example, Hong Kong housing market is sustained by Hong Kong people, and they're actually substantively owned by a lot of property developer from China. So when Hong Kong people flee from Hong Kong on a substantive scale, actually it hurt Chinese interests when, for example, our financial market, our stock market, our housing market are affected.
I'm gonna have to. I apologize. These are all very engaging questions and answers, but I want to make sure that all of the members have time to engage with all the witnesses and ask their questions, especially before we have to go vote in just a bit. So with that, thank you, Mr. Malinowski. I'm going to recognize Mr. Phillips now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to each of our witnesses, I celebrate your courage and gratitude on behalf of this entire committee for being with us today. I woke up to two very troubling headlines in the New York Times this morning. One, China's software stalked Uyghurs earlier and more widely, researchers learn. And second, arrests in Hong Kong as security law sends chill over the city, as we see live reports right now, what's happening in the streets of Hong Kong. I have to give President Xi some credit. He has accomplished something that many thought was impossible, and that is unifying Democrats and Republicans right here in the U.S. Congress, citizens of the United States, all in opposition to his oppressive and repressive policies. The foundation of Hong Kong is freedom, and that foundation has been dealt a terribly damaging blow in the past 24 hours. With that said, we talk about sanctions, we talk about condemnations, but I like the notion of invitations, as my colleague, Mr. Malinowski, just spoke to. That is why I'm an original co-sponsor of his bill, the Hong Kong People's Freedom and Choice Act, which will protect Hong Kongers who are facing persecution. And I also celebrate Boris Johnson's announcement that the United Kingdom is going to offer 3 million Hong Kong citizens with British national status a path to full citizenship. And I want to take this opportunity to call on the rest of the world to consider extending those same invitations to Hong Kongers who are now being oppressed and repressed. So on the notion of invitations versus sanctions, I would love to hear from our panelists today their perspectives on how effective such policies might be. If we might start with you, Mr. Leung.
Thank you for the question. Again, I myself and many of my close friends have to face the very difficult situation of leaving Hong Kong because of decades of possible imprisonment. So having a lifeboat, having a safety valve for people who are in immediate danger and in a situation where the court is not independent anymore because the chief executive could actually handpick judges is extremely important. So that's the first. And I think secondly, invitation and sanction are not mutually exclusive. And I would reference the ideology of the movement that has been very popular in Hong Kong, which is be water. I think people in Hong Kong are very flexible in their tactics. If they have to leave for immediate danger, they would do so, and they will continue their fight in overseas, for example, in the United States. So I think a combination of those strategies by offering tangible pressure on China and on the other hand, offering a viable option for Hong Kong people are extremely important and well balanced.
Thank you, sir. Professor Petersen, if you might share some perspective on invitations.
Yes, I would fully support the idea of the Safe Harbor Act and the Freedom of Choice Act. And I would like to also circle back to a point that one of the representatives made about academics and students. And I would just like to suggest that you might look into the network. There's an international network known as Scholars at Risk, and it is a network of universities all around the world that tries to support academics and students who are at risk of having their academic freedom and other freedoms violated. And often what that needs is some funding to be able to help bring academics on academic visits where they can escape persecution and actually do some research. So I think that would be very productive. And then I would just like to reiterate the importance of the United States being more active in the UN human rights treaty monitoring bodies and ratifying more treaties and getting reactivated when the UN Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Law.
Well, I think it is really important for us to realize that not only people they're facing political suppression and some of them are fleeing out, but for those working on the ground, they also need the attention of the world. So I think these combination of strategies are much needed.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Lee, if you want to share some perspective, we have about 20 seconds left.
Yeah, thank you. I think invitation is one strategy. And I think people in Hong Kong, those especially who are under immense fear of their future security, can have a safe harbor is very important. But at the same time, you know, we are in for the long haul. I think the resistance in Hong Kong will be in for the long haul, and we need a long-term support, and we hope that we can get it. International community support Hong Kong in the long term, not just during just this moment of national security law, but it will go on for some time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. A good reminder to all of us. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. I recognize now Mr. Reschenthaler, Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. You know, earlier today, I heard the speaker come in here and say that she studies Chinese history and politics for an hour a day. You know, that's nice, but maybe we should actually take an hour today and actually run the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. It passed unanimously in the Senate, and this would actually do something. We would actually sanction the bad actors that are cracking down on Hong Kong. So when I hear about the 1 hour a day, it frustrates me because I'm glad people are studying this, but we can actually do something to combat CCP aggression in Hong Kong. And every day, every hour that we delay this, we allow the CCP to consolidate power. We allow the CCP to arrest more freedom fighters. We allow the CCP to erode and chip away at Hong Kong's autonomy. So how about instead of studying this issue, like the speaker says she does, how about we actually take an hour each session day and run bills to hold China accountable? How about we take an hour next session day and we do something about the atrocities on the Uyghurs? How about we take an hour and do something about the theft of intellectual property? How about we take an hour at a one-session day and talk about how the Chinese and the CCP steal innovation from our colleges and universities? How about we take an hour one session day and do something about the Chinese dumping fentanyl into the United States, particularly in my district, where people are actually dying of overdoses? So I'm glad that the speaker says she takes an hour a day to study these issues, but how about instead of studying these issues, we actually do something to hold China accountable? And with all due respect to the witnesses, they're great people. They're doing a great job testifying today, but I don't want to single anybody out. But I've heard about international institutions and how these are the answers. Well, the Chinese have already exploited our international institutions. They've completely taken over the World Health Organization. The WHO has has just parroted CCP talking points. The international criminal courts out here being talked about do nothing but single out Americans and Brits and Israelis. while doing nothing about transgressions of the PLA. So I hope the air conditioning is nice in your ivory tower, but how about you get out of it and actually take a realistic view of foreign policy? And how about you advocate that the speaker and my colleagues across the aisle actually run an act which is going to do something that's better than writing a strongly worded letter and actually have sanctions on CCP members that are overrunning Hong Kong. So again, an hour a day could be better spent actually running bills to hold the CCP accountable. Thank you, and yield back my time.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Allred from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for appearing before us today and commend you for your incredible bravery. I and many Americans watched in awe as the people of Hong Kong took to the streets to protest the proposed extradition laws nearly a year ago in just amazing numbers. And the bravery of the people of Hong Kong, I think, is an inspiration to people around the world. The fight for democracy in Hong Kong is not just a fight for only Hong Kongers. It's a fight for self-determination, human rights, and the advancement of freedom around the world. And as the world's oldest democracy, we must, in a bipartisan way, not only stand with the people of Hong Kong, but we must act. And I agree with my colleagues' statements about the legislation to offer safe harbor and refugee status to Hong Kongers, and the need to not only sign some of our bipartisan legislation, but to also issue sanctions against Chinese officials, while I recognize that that may alone not be enough. The point raised by Mr. Leung several times today, and by Professor Petersen, is one that I want to stress. The way to stand up to China is not through bluster and unilateral trade restrictions, while asking for help with your re-election. The way to stand up to the Chinese is to present a united front of the international community and to engage in the diplomatic mechanisms in the UN and elsewhere to raise and legitimize issues with China. The United States is the only country that can gather the world around these issues. And so we have to lead. These international treaties and mechanisms are only as strong as the U.S.'s commitment to them. When we withdraw, they don't go away. They're just simply used by the Chinese and others who don't believe in the expansion of democracy, in human rights, in the right of self-determination. And as a member of this committee, meeting for the first time after some pretty big revelations have been issued about this administration, I think we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is that the President of the United States has been accused by his former National Security Advisor, John Bolton, of offering his support for concentration camps. Concentration camps. This is such a departure from past U.S. presidents that I can't even really overstate how harmful this is to our status as a leader around the world in human rights. History books will write about this unspeakable breaking of the U.S. commitment to human rights. Now, we have about 2 minutes left in my time. My only question to the witnesses is to offer you a chance to expound upon some of the things you've said today so that the people in my district in Texas and the American people can put a face here in our democratically elected and empowered forum to what's happening in Hong Kong, and to ask you how you feel about this law that's been put in place, this repressive law, and how you feel about what you are seeing and not seeing from the United States. And you can go in any order that you want.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I will come in first. I think everyone in Hong Kong, when they wake up every day, they have to make a decision now. After the law was being passed, what sort of message they should put on Facebook? Should they come out to march and gathering? Will they be arrested? Should I teach my children critical thinking because the Communist Party want to brainwash my children? These are the things that everyday life of the people of Hong Kong are now being threatened. and they are now living in fear of, crossing the red line, so-called. And for me personally, of course, as a political activist, we are also putting ourselves on the line. But I think the people of Hong Kong, as mentioned, we are being ordered. We try to be innovative in our struggle, and we will continue our fight. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. When I know the fact that I have to be forced to exile and leave my home places and come to America, to resume my graduate study, I've met incredible colleagues who share the story about their Iranian family who flee from their country in the 70s, or European country who are under Nazi rule. So it comforts me in the sense to know that U.S. story is actually composed of many people like me and other freedom fighters who actually have to be forced to leave their country. So I hope the U.S. story will continue to inspire people, and I hope that more Hong Kong people will be able to continue their struggle in this place or other countries.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Elred. I now go to Mr. Levin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It feels to me like this is the most troubling time for human rights in China since 1989. And I was in Hong Kong in late May of 1989 in what was the biggest demonstration then in the history of Hong Kong, certainly the biggest I'd ever seen. And I was in Chengdu on June 4th, 1989, and witnessed the killing of demonstrators there in numbers that have never really been recorded properly by history. Today, an estimated 1 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Hui, and other ethnic Muslim minorities are interned in Xinjiang, as Mr. Allred said, in concentration camps. The Tibetan people are denied basic human rights, and the very existence of their culture is threatened. And now the freedom of Hong Kongers hangs in the balance. I wish I could say that the United States has been a champion for the rights of these peoples, but as many of my colleagues have made clear here today, this administration has sent exactly the wrong signals and taken exactly the wrong steps in the case of Xinjiang and Hong Kong and others. Professor Petersen, do you believe that the failure of the United States to be more forceful in its defense of human rights, earlier about Hong Kong, certainly about Xinjiang, has emboldened Xi Jinping?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I do. I think that even though the naming and shaming process may not be a very coercive enforcement process, it is one process that can be effective, particularly if all of the world's leaders get together and really name abuses of human rights publicly when they see them. And if one very influential country like the United States does not participate actively in the international human rights monitoring system, then we weaken it. So yes, I agree with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Last month, the Washington Post published a piece by a Cornell professor named Alan Carlson titled, "What's in Store for Hong Kong? Look at Tibet." Carlson writes, just as China has imposed more rather than less assimilationist policies, each time Tibetans protested Chinese misrule, Beijing has now set the table to adopt a much tougher response to Hong Kong's ongoing protest movement, and I'll add brave protest movement. Professor Petersen, to what extent do you believe the cases of Tibet and Hong Kong are similar in this way?
I think that there are some very important differences. And one of the differences is that Hong Kong did have a very independent legal system and a lot of advantages to begin with. And I think that's one of the reasons that many scholars of autonomy and the model of autonomy in international law thought that it could work in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong had the tradition of an independent legal profession, an independent judiciary, a free press, and had all the advantages of being an international financial city.
Right.
The fact that it hasn't worked shows how it makes it all the more disappointing. I think it shows that the repression of the Chinese government is even more extreme than we thought. The fact that they could do this and get away with it so far, even in Hong Kong.
Yeah, well, that seems so right, but let me ask all of you. I mean, I feel like a thread, I've participated in this whole hearing, and a thread throughout it is that the human rights of people anywhere are threatened when the human rights of people elsewhere are undermined. The Chinese government has used advanced surveillance systems in Tibet and Xinjiang and now really everywhere to undermine people's human rights. I feel like it's really a question of all the countries in the world coming together to make a renewed commitment to human rights, and without U.S. leadership, it's hard to see that happening. Thoughts from any of you?
Agreement. I think we need to put values above profit. I think when Xi Jinping go about around the world, people may talk to him about human rights and then sign a agreement on trade, and then Xi Jinping go away very happy with the profits, the money that he is gaining. But where's the human rights? He would see through hypocrisy, and we need the world to really stick to values and not just looking for the money. I think that is very important.
Thank you. I guess my time's expired, Mr. Chairman, so I'll yield back. Thanks to our tremendous witnesses.
Thank you. I'm going to recognize Ms. Bamberger. Need a second? Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Congress has consistently demonstrated bipartisan support for the people of Hong Kong, and I'm fortunate enough to have been able to do a lot of work over in Hong Kong and in Asia in general. We've supported Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, and we've been consistently interested in making sure Chinese officials who are responsible for human rights violations are punished against these populations. Despite this, and many of the authorities in Congress have provided to the Trump administration to hold the Chinese individuals accountable, President Trump has failed to meaningfully act in support of human rights in China, or really anywhere else. John Bolton wrote in his memoir that President Trump did not want to get involved when millions in Hong Kong were taking to the streets last year. President Trump even praised Xi Jinping's handling of the situation. President Trump also reportedly held off on imposing sanctions against Chinese officials involved with the mass detention camps, because in doing so, he would have interfered with his trade deal with Beijing. My question to you all is, what message does this send to the people of Hong Kong, to the Uyghurs, to the Tibetans, to those frankly fighting for democracy and rights everywhere? My second question is, given Trump's transactional approach towards foreign policy, how can we ensure that Hong Kong does not become a pawn in the broader U.S.-China strategic competition? And I'll turn my question over to either of the witnesses.
Well, I'll take a stab at that. It's a very difficult question, and I don't think the people of Hong Kong deserve to be a political football or a strategic chip to be played. And so while I very much support any measure that will offer safe harbor to the people of Hong Kong and help to name and shame human rights violations anywhere, I do think it's important that we have a stable foreign policy and that it one be based on multilateral actions and multilateral institutions. Thank you.
Do you all have anything else to add to that?
On the second question, I think it's very, we have faith in democracy, and I think any government that are not really sticking to the principles there will be a check and balance on the part of the legislature and also the people movement. So I think it's very important that the message of supporting Hong Kong human rights and freedom and democracy should not stay on just the level the politician, but really go to the everyday life of the people of the United States in linking up union with union. You know, I have talked to the AFL-CIO just yesterday night on the situation in Hong Kong, linking university to university, student union to student. So we need really a people-to-people solidarity in order to make sure that all democracy in the world will listen to the people and be on the side of the freedom and democracy.
Thank you. I very much appreciate your time and your testimony, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. Ms. Vanberger.
I'd like to begin by thanking every one of our witnesses today for speaking with us, particularly given the risks associated with publicly discussing these very sensitive matters. I stand with the people of Hong Kong and their calls for human rights, democracy, and autonomous rule. And during my time as a CIA case officer, I saw the impacts of tools that I consider to be part of the dictator's playbook. For example, it is common for authoritarian leaders to use the guise of national security and the flexibility of vague laws to repress opposition and deter democratic progress. Ms. Petersen, how do you expect the Chinese Communist Party to take advantage of the lack of specificity in the new national security law for Hong Kong to curb freedom of expression and consolidate power?
Thank you. Well, that goes back to one of the points that I didn't quite get to in my testimony, which is that there are a number of vague provisions in the new national security law. However, one of the provisions also says that the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, shall continue to be respected and protected in Hong Kong. And that potentially should serve as a guide to interpreting vague clauses. Unless there's a direct contradiction, a vague clause should be interpreted so as to comply with the ICCPR. And the UN Human Rights Committee has repeatedly held that national security cannot be used as a basis to quash peaceful advocacy for multi-party democracy, constitutional change, etc. But we don't know whether the Hong Kong courts will be able to interpret the law because the law is silent on that fact. And we also know that the NPC Standing Committee, in any event, has the overriding power of interpretation. So it's going to be difficult to know until we see actual cases, but there's real danger that the Chinese government will use these overly broad definitions to capture peaceful advocacy and to prosecute people for peaceful advocacy. Thank you.
And in follow-up to the comments that, or the answer that you just gave, so then is it your assessment that it will be the Hong Kong officials who will have the power to interpret and implement the newly released national security law about how these authorities will actually affect Hong Kong's autonomy?
It really depends, first of all, on where the cases are tried. Carrie Lam, the chief executive, has said, and the law does say that the general rule should be that the Hong Kong SAR has jurisdiction. That means tried in Hong Kong courts. And I have to say that Hong Kong judges, I believe, are by and large very independent, and in general, they have done a good job of enforcing the ICCPR and holding both the Hong Kong government and legislation accountable to that, so that if there's a vague clause, they try to interpret it to comply with the ICCPR. Now, the problem, however, is that the law says the power of interpretation of this law rests with the NPC Standing Committee, which will issue legislative interpretations. It's silent on whether the courts also get to interpret it. I know my colleagues and I have discussed this, and we believe that the power of interpretation is inherent in the Hong Kong judiciary's power of final adjudication, their inherent power of statutory interpretation. So I'm hopeful that the courts of Hong Kong will be able to interpret the law in the course of trying cases. But I can't predict with any certainty, because if the NPC Standing Committee decides it doesn't want that to happen, it can issue an overriding interpretation, which the Hong Kong courts will have to follow. So I can't give you a definite answer. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate it. That's very helpful. While I am concerned, as are some of my colleagues, that the Trump administration has not been consistently firm in communicating and executing its policy towards China, I do commend the State Department for its very strong May 28th joint statement with the governments of Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom in our clear opposition to Beijing imposing a national security law in Hong Kong. Ms. Petersen, one more question for you. Can you speak a little bit about how the United States can demonstrate continued leadership in multilateral settings that you believe would actually set a strong message, send a strong message to Beijing, and encourage the Chinese government to comply with its international obligations?
Yes, I can. Thank you for that question. First, I think the United States should ratify more multilateral human rights treaties. We've actually ratified fewer than China. That doesn't mean we have a worse human rights record, but it means we're not as active in the treaty monitoring bodies, so we're not as influential. Secondly, we need to become active again in the UN Human Rights Council rather than turning away from it because we might not like everything it does. We should become more active in that council. So I think participating in these multilateral efforts is very, very important and can give the United States more influence and more solidarity with other like-minded countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to all the witnesses who may be experiencing time differences to be with us here this morning, thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Vanberger. All right, well, that concludes questions from members, and I'll move to closing remarks now. I want to thank our witnesses for their insight and expertise, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge the Hong Kong American community here in the United States. And although he's not at the witness stand today, I wanted to extend special thanks to Samuel Chu and the Hong Kong Democracy Council for their tireless advocacy, help, and support for Hong Kong. To my colleagues, thank you for joining this important conversation. I'm glad that we can convene, in this case across many time zones through video conferencing, to continue our committee's work in these challenging times. And with that, our hearing is adjourned today.